A woman walked out of a deadly blizzard. No money, no family, no one willing to vouch for her name. She collapsed in front of a fire inside a mountain saloon, and the room full of men laughed. But she didn't ask for pity. She asked for work. And the most powerful rancher in Colorado, a man who had built everything alone and needed nobody, was the only one who stood up. What followed was not a fairy tale. It was a fight. Against a drought that cracked the earth open, against a ruthless enemy who burned what she built, against a world that kept telling her she didn't belong. This is the story of a woman who refused every exit she was offered, and the man who finally learned that the greatest thing on his ranch wasn't the land or the cattle or the money. It was her. Watch until the end. This one will stay with you. If this story moves you, hit the like button and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this has traveled, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss what comes next. The storm had been building for 3 days before it finally broke open over the mountains. By the time it did, there was nothing gentle left about the world. The wind came down off the high ridges in waves, dense and mean, carrying snow that moved sideways and cut exposed skin the way a blade would. The pines along the upper trail bent nearly double. The creek that ran behind Alderman's Pass froze solid somewhere in the second night, though nobody saw it happen. Nobody had been outside long enough to watch. Temperatures dropped past the point where cold stopped being a feeling and became a fact, the kind of fact that didn't negotiate. Evelyn Carter had been walking through it for 11 hours. She didn't know exactly how long. Her pocket watch had stopped somewhere around dusk when the wind got bad enough to force her off the main trail, and she'd scrambled down an embankment through knee-deep drifts, trying to find the lower road she remembered from the map she'd memorized 3 weeks ago in a boarding house in Denver. The map and the boarding house both felt like another life now. The cold had a way of doing that, collapsing time, burning away everything that wasn't immediate and necessary and survivable. She was carrying a canvas bag that had gotten wet in the first hour and had been frozen stiff for the last 4. Her coat was wool, good wool, the best she'd been able to afford when she'd sold the last of her mother's silver brooch collection in September. But wool, even good wool, was not built for this. It had soaked through at the shoulders and the back, and the wet weight of it had been dragging at her since nightfall. Her boots were the other problem. The left one had developed a crack in the sole 2 days ago, somewhere on the lower road before the trail turned steep, and snow packed into it with every step and melted against her foot and refroze and melted again in a cycle that had long since stopped hurting and settled into a numbness. She was trying not to think too hard about. She thought about other things instead. She thought about the look on Thomas Reed's face back in Glenwood Springs when he'd told her, flat and without apology, that the housekeeping position had been filled by somebody's cousin and they wouldn't be needing her after all. Sorry, miss. Best of luck. She thought about the week before that, the hotel in Aspen that had turned her away when the owner's wife took one look at her and decided she had the wrong kind of face for the clientele. She thought about 6 months of wrong faces and filled positions, and we appreciate your interest and the money running out by degrees, $1 at a time, until there was less than $4 in the small leather purse she kept sewn into the lining of the coat. Less than $4. No family left, no letters of reference that meant anything, no one expecting her anywhere. That was the accounting. She'd done it so many times it had lost the power to frighten her, which she supposed was either a mercy or a warning about her own mental state. She chose to treat it as a mercy. She kept walking. The lights of the saloon appeared through the snow the way lights always appeared in bad weather, sudden and disbelieving, like your eyes were playing a trick on you. She stopped moving for a full 3 seconds, just staring, because she'd been telling herself for the past 2 hours that Hatchet's Crossing was real, was actually there, was not something she'd invented from a rumor and desperation, and now here it was, and she felt something embarrassing rise in her chest that she pressed down hard before it could become anything. She started moving again. Faster, which hurt, but she moved anyway. Hatchet's Crossing was not much to look at in any weather. It had grown up around a trading post and a mule relay station 20 years before, and the original buildings were still there, low and square and built close to the ground, the way buildings got when the men who built them were more concerned with winter than with how things looked. The saloon was the biggest structure, a long, low-ceilinged room with a bar running the length of one wall and mismatched tables filling the rest, smelling of sawdust and pipe smoke and the particular animal warmth of too many bodies in a closed space. It was called Decker's, though the man named Decker had been dead for 6 years and his widow had sold to a man named Colby, who'd sold to his brother-in-law, who'd sold again. And now it was run by a woman named May Pruitt, who was 53 years old and had outlasted every owner before her by the simple method of being better at the job than any of them. There were 14 men in the room when Evelyn pushed the door open. She pushed it hard because the wind was behind her and the hinges were stiff, and the door swung wider than she intended, banging against the wall, and the room went quiet. 14 pairs of eyes. The fire in the big stone hearth across the room, the smell of warmth hitting her like a physical thing. She stood in the doorway for a moment. She couldn't help it, and the cold came in around her, and the men nearest the door grimaced against it. "Shut the damn door," somebody said. She shut it. The room kept staring. She was aware of how she looked. She'd been aware of it for the last several hours in the abstract, the way you're aware of something you can't do anything about. But now she felt it acutely. The ice in her hair, the frozen coat, the boots leaving wet tracks on the floorboards. Her face so cold she wasn't sure it was showing the expression she intended. She walked toward the fire because that was the only intelligent thing to do. The men nearest it shifted, not making room exactly, but moving enough that she could get close to it, and she held her hands out toward the heat and stood there while the cold began to leave her in slow, painful stages. Her left foot started burning. That was probably good news. She focused on the fire. "Hell of a night to be outside," May Pruitt said from behind the bar. Her voice was neither warm nor hostile, the voice of someone who'd seen enough of everything to stop being surprised by most of it. "Yes," Evelyn said. Her own voice came out rougher than she expected. "It is." "You come down off the trail?" "Lower road. Came down when the upper trail got bad." Someone at a table nearby made a sound. Not quite a laugh, not quite a snort. "Lower road's been drifted over since yesterday morning," this man said. He was heavy-set, reddish beard, the kind of face that defaulted to skepticism. "How'd you get through it?" "Slowly," Evelyn said. That got a few sounds that were closer to actual laughs. May Pruitt was watching her with an expression that was difficult to read. "Where you headed?" May asked. "Nowhere in particular. I was looking for work in the area. I heard there were ranches east of here." The reddish-bearded man leaned back in his chair. "Ranches east of here aren't hiring women for anything you'd want to know about." "Hal," May said, not loudly. "I'm just saying what everyone's thinking," the man called Hal said, spreading his hands. "She walks in off a blizzard, no horse, no companion, middle of nowhere. Either she's run from something or she's out of her mind." "Possibly both," Evelyn said. She turned from the fire far enough to look at the man directly. Her face had thawed enough that she was reasonably sure her expression was coming through. "But neither one of those things prevents me from working. If anyone in this room knows of someone hiring, housekeeper, cook, supply manager, anything in that range, I'd be grateful for the information." There was a moment of silence. Then someone laughed. Not a small sound, but a full, open laugh, the kind that invited others to join it. A younger man near the back, maybe 19, looked at the man next to him and shook his head. "Lord in heaven," he said under his breath, though not far enough under it. More laughter now. Not cruel exactly. More the laughter of men who'd found something absurd and couldn't quite help themselves. Evelyn had heard that laugh before. She'd heard it in Denver and in Glenwood Springs and in a dozen smaller places between. She'd learned that the worst thing you could do in response to it was let it land. Let it make you smaller. Let it get into the way you held your shoulders or looked at the floor. So she didn't. She stood at the fire and let the room do what it was going to do and waited for it to finish. It finished faster than she expected. Because from the far corner of the room, from a table she hadn't looked at closely yet, a chair scraped back. The sound cut through the tail end of the laughter the way a stone cuts water, and the room shifted. Not dramatically, but noticeably. Several men glanced toward the corner. Someone straightened in his seat. The man called Hal stopped mid-smirk and turned. The man who stood up was not the largest person in the room. He was broad-shouldered but not exceptionally tall, somewhere in his late 30s, with the kind of weathered face you earned from years of outdoor work and not enough sleep, and probably more than a few hard winters. He was dressed plainly, good wool coat, clean but plain. And if you didn't know who he was, you might mistake him for a working rancher, rather than the man who owned more of the land in this valley than anyone else combined. His name was Nathaniel Whitaker. He picked up his coffee cup and walked from the corner to the fire. Not hurrying, not performing anything, just walking, the way a man walks when he's decided to do something and is past the point of debating it with himself. He stopped beside Evelyn, looked at the fire for a moment, then looked at her. He had gray eyes, not cold gray, just gray, the color of sky before weather arrives, and they moved over her face in a way that was assessing without being unkind, like he was trying to read something, not judge it. "Whitaker Ranch," he said. "East Road, 6 miles out. I've got a household of 15 men and no one managing the domestic side since Mrs. Holt left in October." A pause. "It's hard work, harder than most people expect." Evelyn looked at him steadily. "What happened to Mrs. Holt?" "Her daughter had a baby in Pueblo. She went to help and decided she preferred Pueblo." "What's the pay?" He named a figure. It was fair. Not generous, but fair. "And the accommodations?" "Private room off the kitchen. Warm. Locks from the inside." He said the last part in the same tone as everything else, not making a production of it, but it landed the way he'd intended it to, she thought. She'd asked about accommodations because she had to, and he'd answered the actual question underneath it. She looked at him for a moment longer. Around them, the room had gone very quiet. "All right," she said. "I'll take it." Hal made a sound from his table. "Nathaniel, you don't know anything about this woman. I know she walked 11 miles in a blizzard and didn't lose her composure in a room full of idiots," Nathaniel said. He still wasn't looking at Hal. "That's enough to start." She slept that night in a room May Pruitt kept above the saloon for travelers, a narrow space with a rope bed and a window that rattled in the wind. She slept 8 hours without moving, which was the most she'd slept at one stretch in probably 3 weeks, and woke up to gray daylight and her left foot aching in a way that suggested she'd been luckier with it than she deserved. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her hands. There were blisters forming on the 2 smallest fingers of her right hand from where she'd gripped the strap of the canvas bag for so many hours the leather had worked against her skin through the glove. Her shoulders were stiff in a way that reached down into her back. The coat was hanging on a hook near the small stove in the corner. May had come up at some point in the night and built the fire without waking her, which Evelyn was oddly grateful for. She thought about what she was walking into. A ranch with 15 men who hadn't asked for her arrival and wouldn't be happy about it. A position that had no defined edges. Housekeeper, cook, whatever else needed doing. A wealthy employer who'd made a decision on impulse in a saloon and might wake up tomorrow with different opinions. She had no illusions that the offer was because Nathaniel Whitaker saw some particular quality in her. He'd seen someone the room was laughing at who wasn't laughing back. That was a kind of judgment, but it wasn't the same as knowing her. She'd have to prove the rest herself. She got up, dressed, went downstairs, and ate the breakfast May set in front of her without being asked, a practical woman's instinct about what a person needed before a long, cold ride. Nathaniel Whitaker arrived at 8 in the morning with a wagon and a young ranch hand named Billy, who couldn't have been more than 17 and kept stealing glances at Evelyn with the barely concealed curiosity of someone who had a lot of questions and had been told, she suspected, to keep them to himself. The canvas bag went in the wagon bed. Evelyn climbed up to the bench. Nathaniel clicked to the horses. They rode east. The storm had exhausted itself overnight, and the morning was clear and brutal and very white. The road east was mostly packed down from regular traffic, though drifts had built up in the low places, and twice Nathaniel had to urge the horses through them with a patience that suggested he'd done it before. He didn't talk much. Neither did she. Billy sat in the wagon bed and managed to be quiet for about 40 minutes before he gave up on it. "You really walked down the lower road in that storm?" he asked. "I did," Evelyn said. Old Jim Tarrant said it was drifted 3 feet in some places. Parts of it? A pause. How'd you get through the 3-foot parts? Went around where I could. Went through where I couldn't. Billy considered this with the gravity of someone taking notes on a subject they found important. Were you scared? Nathaniel glanced sideways at her, just briefly, and she caught it. Yes, she said. For the first few hours. After that, I was too busy figuring out where to put my feet. Billy nodded slowly, like this confirmed something he'd suspected. He didn't ask anything else for a while. The ranch appeared around a long curve in the road. First the fence lines, white-railed and running straight in a way that spoke of someone who cared about straight lines. Then the outbuildings beyond, and then the main house itself, larger than she'd been picturing. 2 stories of timber and stone, with covered porches front and back and smoke coming from 2 chimneys. It was a working house, not a decorated one. The kind of house that had been added onto as need demanded, rather than designed from the start, which gave it a sprawling, improvised look that she found more reassuring than a showpiece would have been. The yard was busy. Several men moved between the barn and the corral in the cold morning air. They stopped when the wagon came through the gate, watching her arrive. She looked back at them evenly and did not adjust her expression. So, Thomas Reed was the head foreman of Whitaker Ranch, and he was waiting on the porch steps when they pulled up. He was a lean man in his 50s with a face like tanned leather, and eyes that had a permanent squint from years of bright sun and wind. He was not hostile in his posture. He was too controlled for that, but he wasn't welcoming either. He stood on the steps and watched Nathaniel help Evelyn down from the wagon with an expression of careful, deliberate neutrality that was, she understood immediately, its own form of judgment. "Reed," Nathaniel said, "this is Evelyn Carter. She'll be taking over household management." Reed looked at her, then back at Nathaniel. "Where'd you find her?" "Decker's." A pause. Something moved through Reed's expression that he kept tight. "Decker's," he said. "In the middle of the blizzard," Billy offered helpfully from the wagon bed, and received a look from Reed that dried him up instantly. "Mrs. Carter," Reed said, and the title came out flattened, a formality rather than a courtesy. "Welcome to the ranch." "Thank you," Evelyn said. "Mr. Reed, I'd appreciate a tour of the household when you have a moment, or someone who can walk me through the current supply situation and the kitchen arrangements." Reed blinked. He'd been expecting, she guessed, something more deferential, an acknowledgement of his authority, maybe, or at least some visible uncertainty. He got neither. "I'll have one of the boys show you the house," he said. "I'd rather you did," she said pleasantly. "You've been running the ranch since October. You'd know where the gaps are better than anyone." Another beat. Reed looked at Nathaniel, who was in the process of handing the horses off to Billy and was conspicuously not inserting himself in the conversation. Reed looked back at Evelyn. "Give me an hour," he said. "Of course," she said. The house tour took 3 hours. Not because the house was so large, though it was larger than any household she'd managed before, but because Reed, once he started, couldn't seem to stop talking about what was wrong with everything. The root cellar had been improperly stocked before the first frost, and they were already low on things they shouldn't be low on. The kitchen chimney smoked badly when the wind came from the northwest, which it did for 3 months of the year. The supply ledger was a disaster, kept by 3 different people over the past 2 years and maintained in 3 different systems that didn't agree with each other about anything, including the date. She listened to all of it and asked questions and took notes in the small notebook she carried in her coat pocket. Reed watched her take notes. She could feel him recalibrating as they moved through the house. Not warming exactly, but adjusting. He'd come in expecting to babysit a mistake. He was beginning to suspect the situation was more complicated. "The ledger situation," she said, when they were standing in the small office off the main hallway where the household books were kept. "Who kept the records before the last 2 years?" "Old Holt did. Mrs. Holt's husband. He died. And after him? Different people. Whoever Whitaker could get to do it." Reed leaned against the doorframe. "Numbers aren't exactly anyone's strength around here." "Are they yours?" He gave her a dry look. "I move cattle and fix fences, Miss Carter." "Mrs. Carter," she said, not sharply, just a correction. "Mrs. Carter," he said. There was something that might, at the very far edge of it, have been reluctant respect. She looked at the ledger books stacked on the shelf. 3 of them, different sizes, pages sticking out at odd angles. I'll need a week with these before I can tell you where we actually stand on supplies and expenses. In the meantime, I'll need a list of what you consider most urgent. Most urgent is the cattle feed. We're going to run short by February if this winter keeps up. She wrote that down. Who handles the purchasing? Whitaker, usually. Sometimes he sends me. I'll need to see what contracts are in place before the end of the week. Reed was quiet for a moment. You sure do have a lot of needs for someone who just got here, he said. She looked up from the notebook. Yes, she said, I do. Because there are a lot of things that need to happen before this household is running properly. You can make that easier or harder. That's your choice, Mr. Reed, but either way, the needs don't change. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he pushed off the doorframe and walked toward the kitchen. Come on then, he said. I'll show you the cellar. Chuck. The men at dinner that first night were quieter than usual. She gathered from the slight self-consciousness of their behavior. The way they watched her from the corners of their eyes and then looked away. The way conversations dropped out mid-sentence when she moved near. There were 11 of them at the long table in the ranch house dining room, plus Reed, plus Billy, plus a Mexican hand named Cesar who'd been with the ranch longest and sat at the end of the table with the patient bearing of someone who had outlasted many changes and expected to outlast this one too. She served the meal she'd made with what the kitchen had, which was not much but was more than it appeared because the last cook had been ordering without logic, and there were items sitting in the back of the pantry that no one had touched in months. The biscuits were good. She knew they were good because the room got quieter when people tasted them, which was, in her experience, a more honest form of approval than anything said out loud. After dinner, when most of the men had drifted back to the bunkhouse, and the kitchen was cleaned up and the fire in the dining room had settled to coals, Nathaniel Whitaker came and stood in the kitchen doorway. She was at the table with the ledger book spread open in front of her. You didn't have to start tonight, he said. I wanted to see what I was dealing with. She didn't look up. Your supply records are in bad shape. I know. How long have they been like this? A pause. He came into the kitchen and sat down across the table from her, and she had the sense he was deciding how much to say. Since Holt died, 2.5 years. She flipped through to a page she'd marked. Someone's been double billing you for grain deliveries. I found it in 4 separate months. She turned the book and pushed it across the table toward him. See here. Same order, same date, billed twice from 2 different ledger entries. The second entry is written in a different hand. Nathaniel looked at the page. His expression didn't change immediately, but something in the set of his jaw did. He looked at it for a long moment. Are you sure? He said. I found 4 instances tonight. I've only been through half the second ledger. She paused. It's possible it's clerical error, but 4 times is a pattern. He sat back. He rubbed the back of his neck with one hand, looking at some point on the table that wasn't the ledger, and she watched him absorb something that clearly wasn't entirely new, the shape of a suspicion he'd had and hadn't looked at too closely. How much? He said. I don't know yet. I need the 3rd book and a full accounting, but from what I've seen tonight, she hesitated, not for effect but because she wanted to be accurate, several $100 at least. The kitchen was quiet except for the fire. You found this in one evening, he said. The ledgers aren't organized well. It wasn't hard to see once I started looking. He looked at her across the table. It was a different look than the one he'd given her in the saloon. Less the quick assessment of a man making a decision, and more the slower look of someone realizing the decision had turned out to be more correct than he'd expected. Get me the full number when you have it, he said. I will. He stood up, and she thought he was going to leave, but he stopped at the doorway. Reed, give you trouble today? No more than expected. Something at the corner of his mouth moved. That bad? He showed me the cellar, she said, voluntarily. I think we'll manage. He nodded once and left, and she turned back to the ledger books and the fire and the numbers that were beginning to tell her a story she was only partway through. Outside, the wind had picked up again, rattling the window above the kitchen sink. Not a blizzard, nothing like the night before. Just the ordinary voice of winter in the mountains, reminding everyone it was still there. Evelyn Carter turned a page and kept reading. The full number turned out to be $843. Evelyn found it over 3 days, working through the ledger books in the evenings after the kitchen was cleaned and the household was settled for the night. She sat at the kitchen table with the lamp pulled close and a cup of coffee going cold at her elbow, and she worked through it methodically, cross-referencing dates, comparing handwriting, tracing each suspicious entry back through the delivery records Reed kept in a separate folder in the office. It was painstaking, and it was also, in a way she didn't quite admit to herself at the time, satisfying. Numbers had a logic that people often didn't. If you were patient with them, they told you the truth. $843 spread across 22 months. Grain deliveries billed twice, feed orders inflated by small amounts, $5 here, $12 there, an amount small enough that a busy man not looking for it would never catch them. Someone had been careful. Someone had understood that a large theft announces itself and a small one accumulates quietly in the background of a ranch with too much going on and not enough oversight. She brought it to Nathaniel on the third evening with a single sheet of paper. The entries listed in chronological order, the discrepancies noted, the total at the bottom. He read it standing in the doorway of the office, not sitting down, which told her something about how he'd been waiting for it. He read it twice. Then he set it on the desk. "Do you know who?" he said. "I have a suspicion based on the handwriting in the second entries, but I'm not certain, and I don't want to name someone on a suspicion." He looked at her. "Fair. There are 2 men who've handled the supply ledger in the past 2 years. Reed and a man named Alton who manages the grain deliveries on your account at the feed store in town. If you let me see Alton's copies of the delivery receipts, I can compare them to what's in the ledger and narrow it down." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. She'd noticed he did this, went quiet before he spoke when the subject was something he was actually thinking about rather than just responding to. Some people mistook it for slowness. It wasn't. "Alton's worked for this ranch for 4 years, he said. "I know. Reed's been with me for 9. "I know that too." She paused. "That's not an argument against looking." He picked the paper back up, looked at it again, and set it back down. "I'll get you the receipts." The receipts came 2 days later and confirmed what she'd suspected. The handwriting in the fraudulent second entries matched the handwriting on Alton's copies of the delivery forms. Not perfectly, because he'd altered his hand slightly, a slight forward lean becoming a slight backward lean, the kind of change someone makes when they think they're being clever. But the way he formed his sevens was distinctive, a small European-style cross through the downstroke that he'd forgotten to change. She showed it to Nathaniel side by side and watched his expression move through something she couldn't entirely read. Not just anger, though that was in there, but something older and heavier underneath it. "He needed money," Nathaniel said, not as an excuse, as an attempt to understand. "Most people who steal need money," she said. "That part's usually not complicated. His wife was sick last winter. I knew that. I should have—" He stopped himself. "You're not responsible for what he chose to do," she said. "No." A pause. "But I should have been paying closer attention to my own books." She didn't argue with that because it was true. Nathaniel dealt with Alton quietly, so she wasn't in the room for it and didn't ask for details. And when it was done, the feed store sent a different man to handle the Whitaker account, and nobody talked about it openly, which was either discretion or the particular code of silence that operated in small frontier communities where men's reputations were complicated things. Probably both. What the men on the ranch did talk about was her. She'd expected that. What she hadn't entirely anticipated was how granular the suspicion would be. Not just is she capable or can we trust her, but the particular pointed variety that came from men who'd built their sense of a place around knowing who belonged in it. She was wrong in too many ways. Wrong gender for the outdoor work they respected. Wrong background, no family name they recognized, no local history, arrived out of a blizzard on the word of a saloon encounter. Wrong, most specifically, in that she'd come in and immediately found a problem nobody had found before her, which was the kind of thing that didn't make you popular. The grain theft discovery went through the bunkhouse the way all news went through small, enclosed communities. Faster than intended and with modifications. By the version Evelyn heard secondhand through Billy, who reported it to her with the earnest helpfulness of someone who thought she'd want to know, she had apparently accused 3 different men, gotten all of them fired, and was planning to audit the cattle records next with an eye toward getting rid of anyone she didn't like. "That's quite a story," she said. Billy looked slightly pained. "I didn't say I believed it." "Who did?" "Mostly Hennessy, and Croft, and—" He stopped. "Reed?" "Reed didn't say anything," Billy said carefully. "He just didn't say it wasn't true." She thought about that while she finished the bread she was kneading. Reed's silence was its own form of communication. He'd been on the ranch 9 years. His authority had been total and unchallenged and comfortable. Now there was someone in the household who'd found an $800 problem that 9 years of his attention had missed, and she'd found it in 3 evenings, and she'd brought it directly to Nathaniel without going through him first. She'd done that because it was the efficient thing to do, and because she'd correctly understood that going through Reed would have slowed the process down and possibly ended it. But she saw now that efficient wasn't the only consideration. She finished the bread, covered it to rise, washed her hands. At dinner that night, she sat down at the end of the table, which she'd been doing since the first night rather than staying in the kitchen while the men ate, a decision she'd made deliberately and which had been received with varying degrees of discomfort. And when the meal was done and the plates were being cleared, she spoke to Reed directly. "Mr. Reed, I could use your help planning the cellar restock for February. You've got the best sense of what this crew actually consumes in a hard month. Would you be willing to go through the list with me tomorrow morning?" Reed looked at her across the length of the table. Several of the other men watched the exchange with the sideways attention of people pretending not to watch. "I've got the south fence line in the morning," Reed said. "After, then." "Whenever you have time." A pause. She could see him making a decision, or rather, she could see him recognizing that the choice he was making would be visible to everyone at the table, and that visibility was itself part of what he was deciding. "After lunch," he said, "if the fence doesn't take all day." "Thank you." She got up and started clearing plates, and the table began talking again about other things. And she was aware without looking that the temperature in the room had shifted by some small but measurable degree. Thomas Reed was not, as it turned out, a man who did anything by half measures. When he came to her after lunch the following day, the fence had not taken all day, he brought with him a handwritten list of everything he thought the household was missing, in order of importance, with quantities and his best guess at prices. It was the list of someone who'd been keeping track of these things in his head for years, because no one had given him the format to put them down, and it was more useful than anything she could have produced on her own from the ledger books. They sat at the kitchen table and went through it together. He knew things she didn't: which suppliers were reliable, which ones padded their weights, which road got impassable in February, and therefore what needed to be ordered before then rather than after. She knew things he didn't: the books, the patterns of expenditure, the places where money was being spent on things that could be bought cheaper or cut entirely. They argued twice, briefly and practically, and reached different conclusions both times that were better than the position either of them had started with. When they were done, he gathered his papers and stood up. "You're not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" He thought about it. "Someone who'd last 3 weeks. I've had that assessment before," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Really looked. The kind of look that wasn't assessing her competence this time, but something harder to name. "Where are you from originally?" It was the first personal question anyone on the ranch had asked her, which was its own kind of comment on the culture of the place. She'd noticed that the men here didn't ask personal questions directly. They waited for information to surface, the way you waited for something buried under snow to become visible when the thaw came. "Ohio," she said. "Originally, Cincinnati." "What brought you out here?" "My husband died 4 years ago." She said it flatly, not asking for anything. "We'd moved to Denver together. After, I couldn't go back to Ohio. There was nothing to go back to. And I couldn't stay where I was either, so I kept moving west." She paused. "Running out of west eventually." Reed was quiet. "I'm sorry," he said. Not performed sorry, just the plain word. "Thank you," she said. "He was a good man." Reed picked up his hat from the chair where he'd hung it. That list will need to go to Whitaker for approval before we can order anything. I know, I'll take it to him tonight. He nodded and went to the door, and then stopped with his hand on the frame, not quite turning around. Hennessy and Croft are going to keep making noise, he said. In case you were wondering, that's just their nature. It's not personal. I know, she said. Everything is personal. He made a sound that was almost, not quite, a laugh, and walked out. Hennessy was 28 years old and had been on the ranch for 14 months, which was long enough for him to feel established, and not long enough for him to have any real authority, a gap he filled with volume. He was not a cruel man in any deep sense. She'd seen those and could recognize them. But he was the kind of man who needed an audience and was willing to say things in front of one that he wouldn't say alone, which made him more complicated to deal with than a straightforwardly mean person. Croft was his audience, mostly. Croft was 22 and would agree with whatever Hennessy said for as long as Hennessy said it, and would agree with something completely different if someone more dominant stepped in. She'd seen that type before, too. They'd been making comments, small ones, sidelong, the kind designed to be deniable, about the food being too plain, about how a woman running numbers was like a dog trying to read, about how Nathaniel must have had reasons other than housekeeping for bringing her on, delivered with the particular leer that said everything without saying anything. She'd ignored it for 2 weeks. Ignoring things was a skill she'd developed out of necessity and had gotten quite good at. But she was aware that ignoring it had a time limit, that there was a point at which ignoring became permission. The moment arrived on a Thursday afternoon. She was carrying a crate of supplies from the storehouse to the kitchen. A heavy crate. She was managing it, but it was heavy. And Hennessy was coming the other direction from the barn with Croft at his shoulder. And when she passed him, he said something to Croft that she wasn't supposed to hear, but was clearly intended to, a comment about what she must be carrying that crate for, what kind of services she was actually providing. She set the crate down. She turned around. Hennessy was already smirking at Croft, the laugh just forming on his face, and then he registered that she'd stopped walking and turned, and the laugh didn't quite finish forming. Mr. Hennessy, she said. Her voice came out level. She'd worked at that. I want to be clear about something. Hennessy put on an expression of mock innocence that he clearly thought was convincing. I know what you were just, she said. I want to be clear about something. I am here because Mr. Whitaker hired me to do a job. I am doing that job. What I am not here for is whatever you've been implying for 2 weeks. She paused. If you have a problem with my work, bring it to Mr. Whitaker or Mr. Reed. If you have a problem with anything else, you can keep it to yourself because I am done pretending I can't hear you. Hennessy's expression shifted through several things. Surprise, then something defensive and bristling, then an uncertain look at Croft, who had become deeply interested in a fence post. I didn't mean anything by it, Hennessy said. Then it'll be easy to stop, Evelyn said. She picked up the crate and walked to the kitchen. She was aware, from the quality of the silence behind her, that Billy had been coming out of the bunkhouse and had seen and heard the whole thing. She didn't know whether that was helpful or not. By dinner, she'd find out. By dinner, it had apparently been helpful. Hennessy was quieter. Croft ate his food and kept his eyes on his plate. Billy managed not to look openly triumphant, which was more restraint than she'd expected from him. Reed, at his end of the table, said nothing and gave nothing away with his face. But at some point during the meal, he told Hennessy to check the north fence line first thing in the morning instead of his usual assignment, and the way Hennessy received this without argument suggested that some communication had occurred that Evelyn hadn't been present for. She didn't ask about it. Some things were better managed by other people in other rooms, and knowing when that was the case was its own kind of competence. February came in cold and mean and stayed that way. The temperature dropped and stayed dropped, the kind of sustained cold that ground down the cattle and the wood supply both, and the ranch ran on a tighter clock than usual. More hours outside, more weight on the men, shorter tempers and longer silences at the dinner table. Evelyn learned the rhythm of the hard weather weeks. She started breakfast earlier. She kept the dining room fire going all day instead of letting it die back in the afternoons. She figured out that Cesar, the longest tenured hand, got headaches in extreme cold, and that a particular tea she could make from dried willow bark in the medicine cabinet eased them enough that he could work, which he was grateful for in a way he expressed entirely through increased eye contact and the occasional nod, which was more than she'd expected. She was learning all of them, really, the specific shapes of 15 different men's needs and moods and habits, which ones needed to be talked to in the morning and which ones needed quiet until noon, who got along with whom and who had old grievances that wanted management. She was not a sentimental person. She never had been. But she found she paid attention to people the way she paid attention to numbers, with the same patient looking for patterns, the same interest in what was true rather than what was supposed to be true. She was beginning to understand the ranch, and through the ranch, she was beginning to understand Nathaniel Whitaker. He was not a sociable man, but he was not cold. The distinction mattered. He ate with the crew at the big table and knew all their names and knew things about their lives, who'd had a hard fall, whose family was far away, who was saving money for something, in a way that didn't come from asking many questions, but from the kind of long attention that people rarely noticed until they looked back at it. He ran the ranch with a loose authority that was more about being right more often than most people and less about demanding anyone acknowledge it. He worked. That was the most fundamental thing about him. He worked as hard as the men who worked for him, harder sometimes, and he didn't perform it or expect it to be commented on. She'd seen him come in from 12 hours in below-zero temperatures and eat dinner and spend 2 hours at his desk afterward going through correspondence and be up before 6 the next morning without complaint. The work was just what there was to do. He did it. The conversations between them happened mostly at odd hours. Late evenings when she was finishing up the books and he was finishing up correspondence, or in the early mornings before the crew came in for breakfast when the house was quiet. They were not warm conversations in any deliberate sense. They were practical ones that occasionally wandered. He asked her once about the double entry system she'd started using for the household accounts, where she'd learned it, and she'd told him her father had kept books for a manufacturing concern in Cincinnati, and she'd learned it watching him, and she'd seen Nathaniel absorb this without comment, which was how she knew he'd found it interesting. Another time, late, she'd been adding up the February supply costs and had found herself $1 and change off and spent 20 minutes looking for where the error was. And when Nathaniel came into the kitchen for the coffee, he often made himself at 9 o'clock. He'd found her going through the column for the third time and had, without asking what was wrong, sat down across from her and said, "Let me see." She'd pushed the sheet over. He'd found the transposition in 4 minutes. She'd written 16 where it should have been 61, and pushed it back without comment. "Thank you," she said. 17 into 67, he said, meaning the number of items in the column. "You were going to get there." Eventually. He poured his coffee. "Your father teach you the accounting, or did you pick it up yourself?" "Both. He showed me the system. I practiced on his books. He said I had a better head for it than he did." She paused. He was being generous. Or accurate. She looked up at him briefly. He was looking at the ledger, not at her. "Maybe," she said. He drank his coffee and she went back to the books, and they stayed like that, each in their own work, the fire settling in the kitchen stove, the wind doing what February wind did outside, until she finished and said goodnight, and he said the same, and she went down the hall to her room behind the kitchen and closed the door. She lay in the dark afterward and thought about whether she was getting comfortable and whether that was a problem. Comfortable was dangerous when your situation could change. An employer's mood, an injury, a bad season, any number of things could end a position, and she had learned the hard way that getting comfortable was how you stopped paying attention to the signs that told you when to start moving. But she was also, she admitted to herself in the dark, very tired of moving. The thing with Victor Hale began in late February with a visit she wasn't supposed to know about. She knew about it because the kitchen window looked out over the front yard, and she'd been up before dawn on a morning when Hale's wagon came through the gate with Hale himself on the bench and 2 men she didn't recognize in the back. And she'd watched from the window as Nathaniel came out onto the porch and spoke with him for what looked like 15 minutes. And then Hale had turned the wagon around and left. And Nathaniel had stood on the porch in the cold for a minute longer before going back inside. She didn't ask about it. It wasn't her business. But 3 days later, Reed came into the kitchen while she was getting the noon meal together and leaned against the counter and said, in the tone of someone delivering information without being asked, Hale's been buying up the small ranches to the south, 3 in the past 2 months. She turned the bacon. What does he want with them? Consolidation, most likely. He's been land hungry for years. Reed picked up a cup and looked into it without pouring anything. He came to offer Whitaker a price on the eastern pastures. What kind of price? Insultingly low. Nathaniel told him so. Reed set the cup down. Hale didn't take it well. She thought about this. Is Hale the kind of man who does something about it when he doesn't take things well? Reed's expression answered that before he did. He's the kind of man who considers himself important enough that being told no feels like an injury, he said. And he's got the money to make that injury into someone else's problem. The bacon needed turning. She turned it. Outside, someone was moving between the barn and the storehouse, breath-making clouds in the cold air. Thank you for telling me, she said. You'd have figured it out on your own eventually, Reed said. I just thought sooner was better than later. He poured himself the coffee he'd apparently come in for and left, and she stood at the stove thinking about the visit she'd seen from the kitchen window and what it meant that Reed had come to tell her about it, and what it meant that Nathaniel hadn't. She understood both things. Reed's choice she read as a form of trust that had developed slowly enough that she hadn't quite noticed until it was already there. Nathaniel's silence was different, not secrecy exactly, but a separating of categories that she understood even if she wasn't sure she agreed with. His business on one side, the household on the other. What she'd started to understand, looking at the whole of what she'd found in the ledger books and the supply records and the daily workings of the ranch, was that those categories weren't as separate as he believed. The ranch ran as one thing. When trouble came to it, it would come to all of it. She was beginning to think she needed to say that out loud. The opportunity came on an evening in early March when the worst of the cold had eased just enough to feel like cruelty. A day above freezing followed by a night that dropped back into winter, leaving ice on everything the thaw had uncovered. Evelyn had been working through the annual expenditure projections, building out what the next 6 months would cost at current supply prices, and something she was seeing troubled her enough that she knocked on the door of Nathaniel's study rather than waiting for him to come by the kitchen. He was at his desk. He looked up when she came in and didn't seem surprised. She put the projections in front of him. Grain prices, she said. I've been tracking them against what we paid in previous years and against what the feed store has been quoting for the coming months. They're going up. He looked at the numbers. They go up every spring. Not like this. She pulled her chair around so she was beside him rather than across from him, which was a practical choice for looking at the same page, but also, she was aware, a shift in the geography of the conversation. See this column? These are the prices from the last 4 springs. This column is what the feed store is projecting for May through August this year. She tapped the page. It's not seasonal variation. Something's happening with supply at the regional level. I've been reading the commodity reports in the newspapers when they come through. There's been poor harvest conditions in the eastern supply regions. This isn't going to ease. Nathaniel leaned forward, elbows on the desk. He looked at the numbers for a long time. What are you suggesting? He said. I think we should buy winter feed now. Lock in current prices before they climb further. She paused. The storage capacity in the north barn is underused. We could take on a significant order. He sat back, looked at the ceiling. That's a substantial amount of capital tied up in feed that won't be needed for months. Yes. If I'm wrong about the prices, if you're wrong, we'll have bought feed at a slight premium to what we'd have paid in the fall, and the only cost is the storage and the capital delay. She met his eyes when he looked at her. If I'm right and we wait, we'll be paying 30% more in August, when every other ranch in the valley is trying to buy at the same time and there may not be enough supply to go around. He looked at her for a moment. This is a significant call to make on projections and newspaper reports. I know, she said. I'm not telling you it's a sure thing. I'm telling you what I see in the numbers. She left a space. You know this land and these cattle better than I ever will. But numbers are what I know, and these numbers are telling me something. He was quiet. She'd learned to read his quiet somewhat, and this one was not dismissal. It was the one where he was actually thinking, rather than waiting for her to finish so he could respond. Let me look at the capital position, he said finally. What we can move without leaving the ranch short. I've roughed that out on the second page. He turned to it, read it. She watched him. You've been thinking about this for a while, he said. About 2 weeks. Why didn't you bring it sooner? She considered honesty, decided on it. Because 2 weeks ago I wasn't certain enough. And because I've only been here a few months, I wanted to be sure of what I was seeing before I said it. He nodded once. Not at the projections. At her. I'll make a decision by the end of the week, he said. She gathered her papers. At the doorway she stopped, not because she'd planned to, but because something was sitting on the edge of her mind. Mr. Whitaker. He looked up. Whatever Hale is planning, and Reed seems to think he's planning something, it'll go easier for this ranch if the supply situation is solid going into it. She paused. That's all. He watched her go. She felt it, the way you felt a tension like that. Not uncomfortably, but as a fact, the way you feel weather changing before you can see evidence of it. She went back to the kitchen and put the kettle on and stood at the window looking out at the March night, dark and cold and just barely starting, somewhere beneath the surface, to think about becoming something else. Nathaniel said no. He said it at the end of the week, as he'd promised, sitting at his desk with her projections spread in front of him and the capital position summary she'd prepared beside them. And he said it without apology, but also without dismissal. Not the no of a man who hadn't listened, but the no of a man who had listened and reached a different conclusion. The capital risk is too high, he said. If prices don't move the way you're projecting, I've tied up money I need liquid for spring operations. Payroll, equipment repairs, the fence line on the east boundary that needs replacing before summer. He tapped the desk with one finger, a single quiet tap. This ranch has survived hard seasons before. We'll manage. Evelyn sat across from him and kept her face steady. She'd known this was a possible outcome. She'd prepared herself for it. All right, she said. He looked at her. You disagree? Yes. I know. He gathered the papers and squared them. I'm not saying you're wrong about the prices. I'm saying the risk calculus is different when you're looking at the whole of what this ranch owes and needs over the next 6 months. I understand that, she said. You know the full picture better than I do. She meant it. That was the thing she'd been turning over since she'd first put the projections together. The understanding that numbers were only part of the picture and she didn't have all of them. She wasn't the one who'd spent 15 years building this ranch from a 200-acre claim into what it was now. She wasn't the one responsible for 15 men's livelihoods and a herd that numbered in the hundreds. There was a kind of knowing that came from that kind of stake in something that she genuinely didn't possess yet, and she knew it. She went back to the kitchen and finished the supper preparations and said nothing more about it. For 2 weeks. The drought arrived in April without announcement. It didn't come as a dramatic event. No single day where everything changed. But as a slow withdrawal, the way light left a room when someone turned a lamp down gradually rather than blowing it out. The snowmelt that should have fed the creek through April ran thin and stopped. The rains that usually came in the second week of the month didn't. The ground that should have been softening into mud stayed hard, cracked at the surface, pale in a way that made experienced men look at it and then look away. By the third week of April, every rancher in the valley knew they had a problem. By the first week of May, the feed store in Hatchett's Crossing had raised its prices 16%. By the second week, it raised them again. Evelyn tracked it in the household accounts without comment. She bought what was needed for the week and noted the prices and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would be useful. Nathaniel knew. He saw the invoices. He was already dealing with the downstream effects on the herd, cattle losing condition faster than they should in spring, pasture grass not recovering the way it needed to, the daily calculations about how many animals could be sustained on what was available and for how long. He didn't bring up the projections she'd shown him in March, and she didn't bring them up either. That wasn't what was needed now. What was needed now was a solution to a problem that was getting worse faster than anyone had quite prepared for. The commodity reports coming in on the weekly newspaper made it plain. The poor harvest conditions she'd flagged in March had been real, and the regional feed supply was tightening in a way that was turning price increases into price explosions. The feed store in Hatchett's Crossing was limiting quantities per customer. The store in the larger town of Creed, 40 miles east, was doing the same and charging more besides. She found out about the quantity limits on a Wednesday morning when she sent Billy into town for the weekly order, and he came back with half of what she'd sent him for, and a look on his face that said he'd already figured out she wasn't going to be happy about it. "They're only selling 50 pounds of grain per customer per week now," he said. "May Pruitt at Decker's told me there's a man coming through next week from Denver representing a regional feed supplier, but she didn't sound like she thought it was going to help." Evelyn looked at the half order in the wagon bed. Ran the numbers in her head. The numbers she'd been running for weeks, actually, and trying not to run because they kept coming out the same way. "Thank you, Billy." She went inside. She stood at the kitchen window for a long time, looking at nothing in particular, doing arithmetic that didn't improve with repetition. Then she went to the small room off the kitchen where she kept her personal things, the locked box under the bed, the key on the chain around her neck. She sat on the edge of the bed and opened the box and looked at what was in it. $312. Everything she'd saved from her wages since January, added to the 60-something she'd arrived with. It had taken 4 months of careful spending and setting aside, building a reserve against the future she was always half planning for, the moment when things shifted and she needed to be able to move. She sat with it for a long time. The ranch hands' voices drifted in from the yard. Someone laughing at something, someone calling to someone else. Ordinary sounds, the sounds of a place that was functioning and full of people who depended on it functioning. She counted out the money, put the box away, locked it, put the key back on the chain. Then she got her coat and went to find Reed. Boom. She found him at the north barn, working on a harness with the focused, slightly irritable concentration of a man doing a fiddly job he didn't particularly enjoy. "I need to ask you something," she said. He looked up at her. Something in her face must have told him this wasn't routine. He set the harness down. "Ask." If someone placed an order directly with the regional supplier, not through the feed store here, but directly, in quantity, would the quantity limits apply? Reed thought about it. "Don't know. Possibly not. The limits are what the store is putting on their own sales, not anything the supplier mandated that I know of." He paused. "But an order direct from the supplier would have to be large to be worth their time, and paid up front, most likely." "How large?" He named a figure, not as large as she'd feared, larger than she'd hoped. "And if someone placed that order this week," she said, "what's the earliest the feed could arrive? 2-3 weeks if the roads are clear?" He was watching her carefully now. "Evelyn, what are you thinking?" She told him. He was quiet for a moment that stretched out considerably. The horses moved in their stalls. Outside, someone was crossing the yard. "That's your savings," he said. "Yes." Whitaker turned down the forward purchase 2 months ago. He turned down a different version of it. That was about tying up capital for months against uncertain risk. She kept her voice even. "This is about securing supply that is actively disappearing from the market right now. That's not the same decision." Reed looked at her for a long time. He had the face of a man working through multiple thoughts at once and not finding any of them comfortable. "If you do this without his knowledge," he said carefully, "and he decides it was the wrong call, then I'll have spent my own money on his feed, and he can reimburse me for it or not." She paused. "Reed, how long until this ranch starts running short at current supply levels?" He looked at the ground, then at the barn wall, then back at her. 6 weeks, maybe 8 if we're careful." "And what happens in 6 weeks if there's no feed to buy at any price?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The answer was in how he looked at the barn full of horses and then at the pasture beyond where the cattle were grazing on grass that wasn't recovering the way it should. "I'm not asking for your permission," she said. "I'm asking because you know the suppliers and I don't. I need to know who to contact and how." Reed put his hands on his hips, looked at the ceiling of the barn, breathed out through his nose in a long, controlled way. "Sam Elliott," he said, "out of Pueblo. He runs the largest regional feed operation between here and Denver. He'll remember the Whitaker account." He paused. "I'll write you a letter of introduction. It'll carry more weight than a stranger calling." She nodded. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet." He picked the harness back up. "Go before I change my mind." She rode to Creed the next morning before anyone else on the ranch was up, on the ranch's second-best horse because the best one was needed for the cattle work and she wasn't going to take what someone else needed more. She sent the telegraph from the Creed office, a message to Sam Elliott in Pueblo with Reed's letter of introduction and a clear order for winter feed in the quantity the ranch would need to carry them through to fall. She gave her own name on the order, paid the deposit from her own money, which cleaned out a substantial portion of what was in the box. The telegraph operator was a young woman named Fern who had the professional courtesy not to read messages back aloud once she'd confirmed the text, and Evelyn was grateful for that small mercy. She rode back in the gray mid-morning light with the wind in her face and tried to think clearly about what she'd done. It was a calculated risk, she believed in it, but belief and correctness were not always the same thing, and she was riding back toward a ranch whose owner had already told her, in so many words, that this was not a call she was authorized to make. She hadn't lied to herself about that when she'd made the decision. She'd just decided the consequences were worth it. What she hadn't anticipated was that Reed would tell Nathaniel before she got back. Shut up. He was waiting on this porch when she rode through the gate. Not angrily, not with the visible heat of a man who'd been working himself up while he waited. He was just there, sitting on the porch steps with a cup of coffee, watching her come across the yard. The stillness of it was in some ways worse than anger would have been. She tied the horse at the rail and walked to the porch and stood in front of him. "I was going to tell you myself," she said. "I know. Reed told me you'd gone to Creed. I figured out the rest." He looked at her steadily. "How much?" She told him. He absorbed this. "Your savings." "Yes." "From the past 4 months." "Yes." He set the coffee cup down on the step beside him and put his hands together, elbows on his knees, and looked at the yard. A long moment. She stood and waited. "I told you no," he said. "You told me no to a decision that made sense in March. This is a different situation." She kept her voice level. "The feed supply is contracting faster than anyone expected. The store here is limiting quantities already. In 6 weeks, Reed's estimate, this ranch will be short, and there may not be enough feed to buy at any price by then." She paused. "I know I acted without your authorization. I know that's a problem, but I made the call I thought was right. With your own money. Because it was the only money I had authority over." He looked at her then, that gray-eyed look that she'd learned to read somewhat but not completely, the one that had multiple layers going at once, and she could only see the surface of most of them. "What if you're wrong?" he said. "What if the prices ease and supply recovers, and you've spent 4 months of wages on feed we could have bought in September for less?" "Then I've made a mistake and I've paid for it myself," she said. "And you'll have my resignation whenever you want it." Silence. The yard sounds went on around them. Horses, wind, the distant sound of someone working on something metal. Ordinary sounds that had no sense of the weight of what was happening on the porch. "I'm not asking for your resignation," Nathaniel said. "All right. I'm furious with you." "I know." He picked up his coffee, looked at it, set it back down. "The order's placed?" "Deposit paid. Confirmation should come through the Creedy office within 2 days. Delivery in 2 to 3 weeks. And if Elliot can't fulfill it? Then I've lost the deposit and we're back where we were." She met his eyes. "But Elliot can fulfill it. Reed vouched for him." Something moved through Nathaniel's expression at the mention of Reed. He'd known Reed 9 years, and she'd known him 4 months, and Reed had written the letter of introduction anyway, and she could see Nathaniel processing what that meant about what Reed thought of the situation. He stood up. He was taller than her by several inches, and when he stood that close, she was aware of it in a purely physical way, not threatening, just present. "We'll talk about the reimbursement when the delivery comes," he said. "You don't have to reimburse me." "I know I don't have to." His voice was flat. "We'll talk about it when the delivery comes." He went inside. She stood on the porch for a moment and breathed out slowly and looked at the mountains, still snow-capped even in May, cold and indifferent and enormous against the pale sky, and thought about the distance between doing the right thing and having done the right thing, and how you lived in that gap until events decided which one it was. The drought got worse. Through May and into June, it held with a grip that started to feel personal. The sky a pale, washed-out blue every day, the creek dropping to a trickle and then to a series of disconnected pools, the pasture grass going dry and brittle under the sun. Ranches to the south began selling cattle early rather than watch them lose condition, taking bad prices because the alternative was worse. The feed store in Hatchett's Crossing stopped limiting quantities because there was barely anything to limit. Victor Hale came through the valley like a man walking through a burning building with a bucket. Except the bucket had money in it, and he was buying the burning buildings, not saving them. 3 more small ranches changed hands before June was out, each sale at a fraction of what the land was worth in any normal season. Evelyn heard about this through the various channels information moved along in Hatchett's Crossing. May Pruitt, who knew everything that happened within 40 miles. Billy, who talked to everyone. Cesar, who said little but listened more than anyone. The picture that assembled itself was one she didn't like. Hale was acquiring land systematically, pressing in from the south. If he continued at the rate he was going, Whitaker Ranch would be flanked on 2 sides by Hale's holdings by fall. That wasn't illegal. It wasn't even particularly surprising, given what Reed had told her in February. But it had a logic to it that felt purposeful. The kind of move someone made when they were positioning for a larger play, rather than simply taking advantage of opportunity. She brought this to Nathaniel one evening in mid-June, laying it out as a map. She'd actually drawn one, the valley geography rough but accurate, the ranch boundaries marked, Hale's acquisitions shaded in with pencil. Nathaniel looked at it for a long time. "He's been after the eastern pastures for 2 years," he said. "I know, but this isn't about the eastern pastures anymore." She pointed to the shading on the map. "If he controls the southern access roads, he controls the route to the Creed market. Any cattle you drive to sell have to go through or around his land." Nathaniel leaned back. "He knows that." "Yes, he does." She paused. "The drought is his tool, not his goal. He's using it to buy cheap while everyone's distracted trying to survive the season." She looked at the map. "The question is what he does once the drought breaks and everyone realizes what he's assembled." Nathaniel was quiet for what felt like a long time. She'd gotten better at sitting in his silences without filling them. "Sam Elliott's feed delivery is coming Thursday," he said finally. It wasn't a change of subject. It was a statement of position. "This is what we have that others don't." "How long does it carry us?" "Through to October if we're careful. Through September comfortably." He nodded. "Then we're not selling cattle we don't need to sell," he said. "And we're not selling land." He looked up at her. "Whatever Hale's planning, he's not getting this ranch because of one bad season." "No," she agreed. "You should know." He stopped, started again differently. "What you did, with the feed order. I've been thinking about it." "You don't have to." "I know I don't." The slight edge in his voice wasn't irritation. It was precision, the voice of someone who wanted to say something exactly right and was working on it. "When Holt was alive, he managed the books and the household, and he was good at it. After he died, I was too busy trying to keep everything running to realize how much was going wrong underneath the surface." He looked at the map again. "You found the theft. You flagged the supply risk. You made a call I'd declined to make, and you made it right." A pause. "I'm still angry about how you did it. I know. But I'm not wrong about what it means." She looked at him. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the map, the pencil-shaded sections, the roads and fence lines, and the complicated geography of what he'd built. "The reimbursement," he said. "Full amount. I'll add it to next week's wages." "Nathaniel." "Full amount," he said. "It was ranch money spent on ranch needs. It gets paid back." He looked up then, and there was something in his expression she didn't entirely know how to catalog. Not warmth exactly, or not only that. Something more complicated, the way a person looked when they'd made peace with something they'd been fighting. "You shouldn't have had to use your own savings." She didn't say anything for a moment. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and looked back at the map, and she gathered her things and went back to the kitchen. And she stood at the window in the early evening light, thinking about the shape of the conversation, what he'd said and how he'd said it, and the things that had moved in his face that he hadn't quite put into words. She was not a woman who let herself read too much into things. She'd learned that lesson at cost years ago, and she wore it now like a practical garment, useful and not especially decorative. But she was also honest with herself, in the private dark of her own thoughts, and she could not entirely pretend that the conversation had been simply professional. She put the kettle on, watched the mountains go gold through the window as the sun declined. Bam! The feed delivery arrived on Thursday as promised. 3 wagons from Pueblo carrying enough grain and pressed hay to make every man on the ranch exhale with something close to relief. Reed supervised the unloading with the focused attention of a man who had been counting on a thing happening and was only now letting himself believe it had. Billy kept touching the hay bales as if confirming they were real. Even Hennessy, who had maintained a studied indifference to most things Evelyn was involved in, had the grace to look slightly awed by the scale of it. Word got around Hatchet's Crossing faster than it should have. By the following week, 2 neighboring ranchers had come to ask Nathaniel if he could spare supply, which he could and did, at cost rather than at the inflated market price, which was the kind of decision that built the sort of reputation that lasted, become his opportunity. Whitaker's feed stockpile disrupted that calculation in 2 ways. It kept Whitaker solvent when he was supposed to be desperate, and it gave 2 of the ranches Hale had been circling away to survive the summer without selling. Hale, by the bookkeeper's account, had not responded to this calmly. He'd sent a man to the ranch the following week, not Hale himself, a younger man Evelyn didn't recognize, well-dressed and with a practiced air of pleasantness that didn't reach his eyes. He asked for Nathaniel. He waited on the porch. When Nathaniel came out, she watched from the kitchen window with the same attention she'd brought to the original visit in February, and what she saw was shorter and less civil than that conversation. The young man did more talking, and Nathaniel did less, and when the young man left, there was a set to Nathaniel's shoulders as he came back inside that she'd learned to read as the particular tension of someone who has been insulted and is deciding what to do about it. She didn't ask. Nathaniel didn't volunteer. Reed came to find her later. Hale wants to buy the feed stockpile, Reed said, at what he's calling fair market price, which means his price, which means a price that would leave us short for the summer and profit him and hurt the ranches we've already sold to. Reed's jaw was tight. Nathaniel told him no. Good. Hale's man implied there would be consequences. Reed looked at her steadily. The man Hale sent, his name's Denny. He works for Hale doing the kind of jobs that Hale doesn't want his own name on. She absorbed this. What kind of jobs? Reed didn't answer immediately. The afternoon light came through the barn window and lay in bars across the floor between them. The kind, he said finally, where afterward things are different, and nobody can prove exactly why. She thought about the south fence line that had been cut twice in the past month, both times in places that would let cattle drift toward Hale's land. She'd heard about it from Billy and assumed it was ordinary fence trouble, the kind that happened in any large ranch. Now she recalibrated. How much does Nathaniel know? She said. He knows about Denny. He's been dealing with Hale for 2 years. He's not naive about what kind of man he's dealing with. Reed paused. But knowing and being able to prove are different things out here. Hale's got money and connections and patience. He plays a long game. So do we, she said. Reed looked at her for a moment. Then he made the sound that might be a laugh and picked up his tools and went back to work. The fire started at 2 a.m. on a night in early July, when the drought had cracked the earth and dried everything on it to the consistency of kindling. Evelyn woke to the smell before she heard anything. A wrong smell, sharp and acrid, coming through the gap under her door. She was on her feet and out of the room before she was fully awake, moving on the instinct of someone who had grown up around her father's factory and learned young what fire smelled like and what you did when you smelled it. She hit the back porch and saw it immediately. The supply barn, 40 yards from the main house, lit from inside with the orange-red glow that meant the fire had been going long enough to be serious. The roof was still on, but the glow at the seams between the boards and around the hayloft door meant the interior was already a furnace. She screamed for the bunkhouse. Not a word, just volume, the full force of her voice in the direction of the men's quarters, and then she turned back to the well and grabbed the closest bucket because that was what you did. You started with what you had, and you kept moving, even when what you had wasn't enough. The yard filled up in less than 3 minutes. Men came out half-dressed and already moving toward the well and the water barrels, the way men who worked around livestock learned to respond to fire, which was to treat it as the worst possible thing immediately, because it was. Nathaniel came out of the main house already pulling his coat on, and Reed came out of the bunkhouse first and was already directing men before he was fully visible in the firelight. The bucket line formed. It was not enough. It was not going to be enough to save the barn, which everyone present understood within about 90 seconds of the line forming. But you kept going because stopping was not an option, and because you could still save the surrounding structures and the animals in the corral nearby and the main house itself, and keeping the fire from spreading was the battle even if the barn was already lost. She was in the line, passing buckets, and she was aware of the heat at her face and the smoke burning her eyes and the noise of it. Fire was always louder than people remembered, a roaring, cracking, alive sound that pressed on you from all directions. Then she heard something else. Under the fire noise, under the shouting of men and the screaming of horses in the corral who could smell it, a sound that wasn't fire, a human sound. She stopped passing the bucket in her hands. The man behind her said something sharp. She wasn't listening. She was tracking the sound, trying to locate it in the noise, and then she had it. From the side door of the barn, the smaller door on the eastern wall that was used for moving equipment, she grabbed the arm of the man next to her. Someone's inside. He looked at her. What? Inside the barn. There's someone in there. She was already moving toward the door. He grabbed her arm and she pulled out of it and ran. The heat at the side door was ferocious. She felt it as a wall, something physical that pushed back against her. And the smoke coming from the gap at the bottom was black and thick. She pulled her coat up over her nose and mouth, grabbed the door handle through the fabric of her sleeve, felt the heat of it even through the cloth, and pulled. The inside of the barn was a landscape from somewhere beyond ordinary experience. The hay in the loft was fully alight, sheets of orange climbing the walls, and the air was so thick with smoke that she couldn't see more than 10 feet. But the screaming was closer now, and she followed it. He was in the corner behind the grain stacks. One of the younger hands, a boy named Pete, who couldn't have been more than 16, and who had apparently been sleeping in the barn because he'd lost his bunk spot to a new hire and hadn't told anyone. He was on the ground, trapped where a burning roof beam had come down across a stack of crates that had fallen against him, not crushing him but pinning him, and he was screaming and coughing and trying to push the crates away without being able to get the leverage he needed. She crossed to him through smoke that made her eyes stream and her lungs seize. "Pete!" She grabbed his arms. "Stop pushing and tell me if anything's broken." "My leg. Broken or just hurt?" "I don't... just hurt, I think." "Then I need you to push when I pull the crate. Can you do that?" He nodded. He was terrified in the way that young people were terrified, entirely and nakedly, with no experience to make it smaller. She braced herself against the grain stack and got her hands under the crate. "Now!" He pushed. She pulled. The crate moved 6 inches and she lost her grip and got her hands back on it and pulled again, and this time it shifted far enough that he could drag his leg out, and she grabbed him by the arm and got him upright, or nearly, and started pulling him toward the door. The roof section above the loft chose that moment to give way. She heard it before she saw it, a crack that went through the roar of the fire like something tearing, and she pulled Pete to the left without thinking, just moving, putting the grain stacks between them and the collapse, and the beam and burning boards came down in a cascading wreck where they'd been standing 2 seconds earlier. The side door was 10 feet away. She kept moving. She was aware, at some point between the collapsed section and the door, that she'd stopped being able to see much and was navigating by memory of where the door had been, and that Pete was coughing in a way that had gone past the voluntary and into the involuntary, and that the heat had reached the level where it was going to make decisions for her if she didn't make them first. She hit the door with her shoulder and it opened outward, and they fell through it into the night air, which should have felt like relief but felt instead like hitting cold water. A shock that was its own assault on a body that had adjusted to the wrong things. She went down on her knees in the dirt. Pete went down beside her. Then there were hands, many hands, and someone was pulling Pete further from the barn, and someone else was pulling her, and she heard Nathaniel's voice saying her name in a way she'd never heard him say anything before. The word stripped of its usual control, just the bare sound of it. She let herself be pulled. She was aware of the ground under her knees, then her palms, then her cheek, when she put her face down for a moment because she needed to, and the earth was cool compared to everything else. She was aware of someone doing something to her hands. She was aware of the barn continuing to burn and men continuing to fight it. Then Nathaniel's face was close to hers. She registered that he was on the ground too, one knee in the dirt, which she understood as information about how urgent he'd found the moment. "Are you hurt?" he said. She took stock. Her hands were burned at the palms. She could feel that now, a specific and detailed pain that was arriving in stages as her body caught up with events. Her eyes were streaming. Her lungs felt like she'd inhaled something she hadn't finished processing. "My hands," she said. He looked at them. She heard him say something under his breath, not a word she could make out, or maybe not a word at all. And then he was helping her up and calling for water and the doctor from town and keeping his hand at her back with the particular steadiness of someone who is scared and is not going to show it, but cannot quite remove the evidence of it from how they are touching you. She let him help her. The barn burned through to morning, a pile of black timbers at the end, the feed stockpile gone with it. All of it, 3 wagons worth of summer supply, reduced to ash and char in the hours it took the fire to exhaust itself. The other structures were saved. Pete was alive. Her hands would heal, the doctor said when he arrived at first light. 2nd degree at the worst of it. Nothing that would leave her unable to use them. Painful for weeks, but functional. She sat on the porch in the early morning while the doctor wrapped her hands and watched the remains of the barn smoke in the gray light, and she thought about the smell that had woken her, and the question of what exactly had started a fire in a sealed barn on a windless night with no lightning and no lanterns left burning. Reed came and stood near her when the doctor was done. He looked at what was left of the barn for a long time. "The door was latched from outside when we got to it," he said quietly. "Side door and the main one both." She looked at him. "I know," she said. He nodded once and walked away, and she sat with her wrapped hands in her lap watching the smoke rise and thinking about Victor Hale and long games and the space between knowing and proving, and what happened to a ranch that was already stretched when its summer's feed supply turned to ash on a July morning. The doctor's name was Aldous Fenn, and he had been serving the ranching communities around Hatchett's Crossing for 11 years, which meant he had seen most varieties of human damage and had developed the particular bedside manner of a man who understood that what people needed most immediately after trauma was not comfort, but clarity. He rewrapped Evelyn's hands on the porch in the early light, his movements efficient and without unnecessary gentleness, which she appreciated more than she could have explained. "The palms are the worst of it," he said. "The right hand more than the left. Keep them clean, change the dressing every 2 days. Don't use them for anything more than you have to for the first week." He looked at her over the top of his spectacles. "I mean that. Not cooking, not lifting, not anything that puts pressure on the burns. The household can manage for a week without you killing yourself over it." He tied off the bandage. "You also inhaled a significant amount of smoke. Your lungs are going to be unhappy with you for several days. If you develop a fever or the coughing gets worse rather than better, send for me immediately. Don't wait." "And Pete?" Fenn glanced toward the bunkhouse where the boy had been taken. "Smoke inhalation, bruised ribs, some abrasions. He's 16 years old and built like a young ox, and he'll be fine, largely because you got him out when you did." He paused, and his professional neutrality bent very slightly. "Another few minutes in that barn and I'd be having a different conversation this morning." She nodded. "Rest," he said, and stood and closed his bag and went to check on Pete. She sat on the porch with her wrapped hands in her lap and watched the last of the smoke rise from the barn ruins in the pale morning light. The yard was quiet in the way that places were quiet after something catastrophic. Not peaceful, but emptied out. The ordinary sounds of the ranch subdued under the weight of what had happened. Several of the hands were moving around the perimeter of the ruin, not doing anything specific, just looking the way people looked at the remains of a thing they'd relied on. Cesar was standing at the far edge of the debris, hat in his hand, and she couldn't see his face from here, but the set of his shoulders told her enough. The feed was gone. She'd been doing the accounting in her head since she'd sat down. Couldn't stop herself. It was how she processed disaster, by measuring it. 3 wagons of grain and pressed hay, enough to carry the ranch to October, reduced to ash in the hours between 2 in the morning and first light. What remained in the storehouse, which had been saved because it was far enough from the barn and the men had gotten to it fast, was sufficient for perhaps 5 weeks of normal operation. After that, they were buying at market prices that had nearly doubled since spring and would keep climbing through August. 6 weeks, Reed had said in April. That number had been accurate then, before the feed delivery. Now it was accurate again. She heard the front door open and Nathaniel came out and sat down on the step below her, which put him at a slightly lower level, and she understood this as something he'd chosen rather than something that had happened by accident, though she couldn't have explained how she knew. He had a cup of coffee. He offered it to her without speaking. She took it with her bandaged hands, awkward, the cup hot against the wrapped palms, in a way that wasn't painful, just present, and drank from it and handed it back. Reed tells me both doors were latched from outside, Nathaniel said. Yes. He told me the same. A latched door doesn't latch itself. No. Silence. The smoke drifted across the yard. A horse moved in the corral. I don't have proof, he said. I have strong suspicion and a latched door, and a man with a known grievance and a history of employing people to do things he doesn't put his name on. His voice was controlled in the way that very controlled anger sounded. None of that is something I can take to the county sheriff and expect to accomplish anything with. No, she said. Not yet. He looked at her. Not yet. Hale's been careful, but careful people make mistakes when they're frustrated, and he's frustrated now. She turned the coffee cup carefully in her bandaged hands. He tried to buy us out, and we said no. He tried to use the drought to starve us into desperation, and we had feed. He had someone burn our feed supply, and now he's waiting to see if that finishes us. She paused. He thinks we're done. Are we? The question came out without the protective irony she'd have expected from him, or the rhetorical confidence of a man who already knew the answer he wanted. It came out plainly, which was its own statement about where he was this morning, sitting on the porch steps with a cup of coffee after watching his supply barn burn. Not if we move fast, she said. Moving fast, with bandaged hands and lungs that had opinions about smoke, turned out to mean directing rather than doing, which was its own education. She sat at the kitchen table that afternoon. Doc Fenn's prohibition on cooking was specific enough that she'd been able to argue herself into the chair with the account books, which involved neither lifting nor pressure on the burns. And she worked through the numbers while Billy did the things she told him to do and reported back, which he did with the earnest precision of someone who understood that precision was being required of him and was rising to it. The situation was bad, but not, she decided after 2 hours of arithmetic, unsurvivable. The storehouse supply would carry them 5 weeks. 5 weeks of drought weather in July put them at early August. The question was what they could secure before then. She sent Billy to the telegraph office in Creede with a message to Sam Elliott in Pueblo. Not for the same quantity as before, which they couldn't finance at current prices, but for whatever partial order Elliott could fulfill from existing stock at the best rate he could offer a repeat customer. She then worked through the household budget with the particular grimness of someone cutting until it hurt and then cutting a little more. Supplies they could do without, meals that could be simpler, anything that was comfort rather than necessity trimmed out and the difference calculated. It was not a large number when she was done, but it was something. The third thing was harder. She sat with it for a while before she brought it to Nathaniel because she wanted to be sure of it and because she was aware that what she was about to suggest was a different kind of decision than anything she'd recommended before. She found him in his study that evening, going through correspondence with the focused unhappiness of a man dealing with administrative reality when he'd rather be doing something physical. He looked up when she came in and closed the folder he'd been reading. "Sit down," he said. "You shouldn't be on your feet." "I'm fine." "Evelyn." She sat down. "I've been going through the supply numbers," she said, "and I have a thought about the situation with Hale that I want you to hear." He leaned back. "Go ahead." "He's buying distressed ranches. He's been doing it systematically. The ones he's acquired in the past 4 months, Beaumont's Place, the Keller Spread, the Anderson Claim, those families took his price because they were out of options. They didn't want to sell." She kept her eyes on him. "What if they didn't have to keep that sale?" Nathaniel was still. Hale's purchases, Has anyone looked carefully at whether they were conducted properly? Filing dates, survey accuracy, the recorded prices against actual transaction values? She pressed on. Land fraud on the frontier isn't complicated to execute because the recording systems are imperfect. It's also not impossible to unwind if someone looks carefully enough. You think he's been filing fraudulent claims? I think a man who uses employees to latch barn doors from outside and then walks away is not a man who worries deeply about legal precision. She paused. I don't know. I haven't seen the filings, but if I could see them, the county records office in Creede, he said slowly. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. She could see him working through it, the possibility against the probability, the cost of being wrong about this against the cost of not trying. Your hands, he said. I can read with bandaged hands. Not for another week, you're not going to Creede. Then someone I trust goes first and tells me what they find. She met his eyes. Read. Nathaniel looked at her for a long time. She had the sense, as she sometimes did in conversations with him, of watching something move behind a surface she could only see part of. You've been thinking about this since this morning, he said. Since this morning, yes, but the shape of it has been forming for longer. Since I told you about Hale in February. Since Reed told me about Denny, she said. And what kind of work Denny did? He nodded slowly. Not agreement, exactly. Acknowledgement. I'll talk to Reed, he said. Chet. The rumors started the following week. She'd expected some version of this, had said as much to Reed before he left for Creede, when she'd gone over with him exactly what to look for in the county land records. What she hadn't anticipated was the specific form they took, which was not just the ambient suspicion she'd dealt with since January, but something more pointed and uglier. The story, as it circulated through Hatchett's Crossing and the surrounding ranches, was that Evelyn Carter had advised Nathaniel Whitaker to take on a risky financial position that had ultimately led to the loss of the supply barn. The implication being that her judgment, or possibly her motives, had contributed to the ranch's current difficulties. There were variations. One version had her personally responsible for the fire, through negligence, if not intent. Another suggested she'd had some prior relationship with the man who'd stolen from the accounts. None of it had any factual basis. All of it had the particular design of something constructed rather than grown. She knew where it came from. Knowing didn't make sitting in it more comfortable. May Pruitt told her about it on a Wednesday afternoon when Evelyn came into Decker's for supplies. Her hands well enough after 10 days that she could manage light work, though the right palm still hurt with any real pressure. May told her flatly and without cushioning it, because that was May's way and also because she thought Evelyn needed to know. It's Hale's people spreading it, May said. Denny's been in here twice this week, talking to people who were willing to listen. How many people are listening? May looked at her steadily. Some. Not as many as Denny would like. She paused. The ones who know you aren't. The ones who don't know you. Some of them are, because it's a story that fits a shape they already had in their heads. Woman comes in from nowhere, gets a position on a wealthy man's ranch. Things go wrong. She spread her hands. People like a story with a shape. Evelyn bought what she'd come for and rode back to the ranch and said nothing to anyone about it until dinner, when she looked around the table at 15 men who'd been working beside her for 6 months, and noticed that they were all, without exception, eating the meal she'd made and talking among themselves with the same noise and texture as any other dinner. After the meal, when the plates were being cleared, Hennessy, of all people Hennessy, stopped in the doorway of the kitchen. Heard what Hale's man has been saying around town, he said. She looked at him. It's garbage, Hennessy said. He said it with the slightly combative certainty of a man who knew he was correcting a prior position and wasn't going to make a thing out of it. Anyone here who's got eyes knows it's garbage. He walked out. She stood at the sink for a moment. Her right hand was in the warm water, and the palm ached, and she was aware of being, for reasons she couldn't entirely account for, on the unsteady side of composed. Billy appeared at her elbow. He's been telling people that all week, he said, in the tone of someone providing useful context. Hennessy, in the bunkhouse. He's pretty loud about it when he gets going. I didn't know that, she said. Well, Billy looked slightly pleased with the world. Now you do. Reed came back from Creed on a Friday morning with a leather satchel of copied records and a look on his face that mixed satisfaction with something more sobering. He laid it out for both of them at the kitchen table. Evelyn on one side, Nathaniel on the other, the copied documents spread between them, and walked them through what he'd found. 3 of the 4 recent Hale acquisitions had recording irregularities. The Beaumont purchase had been filed at a declared price that was 40% below what witnesses to the transaction said had actually been paid, which suggested tax evasion at minimum and potentially that the recorded deed didn't reflect the actual agreement. The Keller spread had been surveyed with a boundary description that, when Reed had checked it against the original territory survey on file at the land office, enclosed approximately 60 additional acres that weren't part of the Keller claim, land that in fact bordered Whitaker territory on the south side. The Anderson claim was the clearest. The recording date on file was 2 weeks before the date on the agreement document that Martin Anderson had signed, which meant either the deed had been filed before the sale was agreed, impossible legally, or the filing date had been altered after the fact. Nathaniel went through the documents twice. He was quiet while he read in the way he was quiet when he was thinking, not when he was stalling. "This is enough to take to the county recorder," he said. "Possibly enough to take to the district land commissioner," Reed said, "which is above the county recorder and not subject to whoever Hale has relationships with locally." "Anderson's still in the area? And the Kellers?" "Anderson's in Hatchett's Crossing, staying at the boarding house on Mill Street. He sold because he thought he had no choice, not because he wanted to." Reed's expression was dry. "He had some opinions about Hale when I spoke with him." "You spoke with him already." "I thought it was useful to know if he'd be willing to make a statement." Nathaniel looked at Reed, then at Evelyn, then back at the documents. "Evelyn," he said, "this was your idea." "The land records were your suggestion," she said. "I only said someone should look." "It was your idea." He wasn't arguing, just being accurate. "Do you know a land attorney?" "I know of one in Denver. He represented a claim dispute for my father's business associate several years ago and won it." She paused. "I can write a letter of introduction." "Do that." He gathered the documents and squared them. "Today." She wrote the letter that afternoon. Her right hand made it slow and slightly painful, but she wrote it herself because it needed to be in her hand for the introduction to carry the weight she intended. She wrote it to a man named Corbin Staley, who had an office on Larimer Street in Denver, and she laid out the situation concisely and precisely. The irregularities Reed had found, the Anderson filing date discrepancy, the boundary error on the Keller survey, what they needed and what they had to support it. When she was done, she read it over once, made 2 corrections, and folded it. She was sealing it when Nathaniel came into the kitchen. He looked at the letter, then at her hands. The right bandage was slightly spotted at the palm, where the writing had put pressure on the worst burn. "I could have written it," he said. "You don't know Staley." "I could have taken your dictation." She looked at him. "I'm not an invalid." He looked at her for a moment, and then he pulled out the chair across the table and sat down, which she hadn't expected. "I want to tell you something," he said. She waited. "When I came out of the house last night and I saw you coming through that barn door with Pete..." He stopped. He seemed to be locating the words, which was unusual for him. He was a precise talker when he talked at all, not someone who lost his way in a sentence. "I've been running this ranch for 15 years. I've had men injured. I've had animals die. I've lost buildings to weather and fire, and I've handled all of it as part of the business of this place." A pause. "Last night was different. When I saw you come through that door and go down..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't look away from her, which she understood as its own kind of completion. The kitchen was very quiet. The fire in the stove. The afternoon light coming in at the angle it came in at this time of day, making rectangles on the floor. She should say something practical. She knew how to do that, how to take a conversation that was moving toward something complicated and give it a clean, sensible exit that both people could take without having to address what had almost been said. She'd done it before. It was a useful skill. She didn't use it. "I know," she said. Just that. 2 words that acknowledged what he'd said without requiring him to finish the thing he hadn't said, and that were, she recognized in the moment she said them, a form of reciprocity she hadn't fully planned. He looked at her for another moment. Then he stood up and said, "Let me see the address on that letter, and I'll make sure it goes out on the morning stage." She told him the address. He took the letter. He went out. She sat at the table for a moment with her hands in her lap, the right one aching, and thought about what had just happened and what it meant and whether she was being careful enough about something that it was important to be careful about. She concluded, after honest examination, that careful and correct were not the same thing, and she'd been confusing them. She got up and started on the supper. 3 days later, a man named Cully, who worked the fence line on the southern boundary, found something that changed the shape of everything. He brought it to Reed, who brought it to Nathaniel, who came to find Evelyn in the kitchen with a look on his face she hadn't seen before. Not angry, not calculating, but something rawer. He put a small metal object on the table in front of her. It was the head of a broken fire striker, the kind used to light lanterns, newer than anything they used on the ranch, with a particular maker's mark stamped into the base that she looked at carefully and then looked at Nathaniel. "Where was it found?" she said. "South side of the barn ruins, in the dirt about 4 feet from where the exterior latch was." "Hale's mark?" "Not Hale's." Nathaniel's voice was controlled. "It's the mark of a tool supplier in Creed that services his operation specifically. I know the mark because I've seen it on his equipment at county events. He uses them exclusively." A pause. "Denny was seen in Hatchett's Crossing 3 days before the fire. May Pruitt can confirm it." She looked at the striker. "A drop tool isn't proof." "No, it's not." He pulled the chair out and sat down heavily, in the way of a man whose body was carrying weight that had accumulated. But combined with the records Reed found, and Anderson's testimony about the filing date on his deed, and the witness statements May has agreed to provide about Denny's movements, he spread his hands. "It's a picture. Even if each piece has an explanation, the picture doesn't." "You need Staley," she said. "I need Staley, and I need the district commissioner, and I need to not do anything that gives Hale an excuse to make this about retaliation rather than evidence." He looked at her. "That means the next 2 weeks are about building the case, not responding to what's been done. And in the meantime, he keeps talking to people through Denny." "Yes." His jaw was tight. "In the meantime, yes." She understood the restraint this required of him, because she was feeling the same restraint and she had less at stake in this particular piece of ground than he did. The anger was not unproductive. It was the kind that sharpened rather than clouded, the kind that said, "This is wrong, and I'm going to fix it in the most thorough way possible rather than the most immediately satisfying one." "All right," she said. "Then we build the case." The town meeting happened without anyone planning it. It assembled itself the way frontier community meetings sometimes did. Out of enough people needing to be in the same place at the same time for enough different reasons that eventually someone suggested the obvious. May Pruitt's saloon on a Thursday evening in late July, with most of the ranching families in the valley present either in person or by representation, because there had been enough drought and enough fear and enough whisper campaigns and enough watching neighbors sell at prices that didn't make sense for people to want to be in a room together and say so. Evelyn had not intended to speak. She went with Nathaniel and Reed because it seemed foolish not to be there, and because May had asked her specifically, and she sat in the back of the room near the window and intended to listen. Victor Hale was there. She'd known he would be. He sat near the front in the good coat of a man who had made the calculation that appearing untroubled was more useful than appearing concerned, which was the calculation of someone confident in his position. He was 62 years old, gray-haired, with the large, deliberate physical presence of a man who had used size and money to get most of what he wanted in life and had stopped distinguishing between the two methods. He spoke early and well in the measured tones of someone who had prepared, expressing concern about the valley's drought situation, making noises about community support and collective response, gesturing toward the ranches he'd purchased as evidence of his commitment to keeping the land in production rather than letting it fail. He was good at it. She could see people in the room listening with the uncertain expression of those who had misgivings they couldn't exactly articulate. Then someone near the front, she didn't know the man, a small rancher named Guthrie from the west side of the valley, said that he'd been approached by Hale's people and the price he'd been offered for his land was less than half what it was worth before the drought, and he'd like to know if that was what the community was calling support. The room shifted. Other voices came in. The kind of voices that had been holding things back and found a small opening and moved into it. People with specific concrete experiences to report that were harder to argue with than general principles. Beaumont's son, speaking for his father, who was ill, describing the pressure the family had been under before the sale and the conditions that had been implied rather than stated. Two neighbors of the Keller spread who had heard the Kellers' account of their transaction and had questions about the boundary survey. Hale was managing it. He was good at managing it. He had answers for each thing, or near enough answers, the kind that created just enough uncertainty that no single complaint became a consensus. Then Nathaniel stood up. He didn't speak immediately. He stood and let the room register him and went quiet the way it always went quiet when he stood in it, and she understood that this was the weight of 15 years of being exactly what he was in this particular place. "I'm not going to talk about what I can't prove," he said. "I'm going to talk about what I know." He laid it out, concisely, in the way he did everything. The Anderson filing irregularity, the boundary discrepancy on the Keller survey, the contact they'd made with the district land commissioner's office in Denver. He didn't accuse. He reported. He let the facts carry the accusation themselves, which was more effective than anything accusatory would have been. The room was very still. Hale's face, by the time Nathaniel finished, had moved through several things she was watching from the back. The controlled response of someone managing a situation, and under it the tighter expression of a man who had not expected this level of preparation and was recalculating. Then someone in the room, she still didn't see who it started with, asked who had put the records research together. Nathaniel said her name. He said it simply, without preamble or performance. Evelyn Carter, the household manager at Whitaker Ranch. And then he said something else that she hadn't expected and for which she was completely unprepared. "She's also the reason this ranch still has cattle to sell this fall," he said. "She saw the supply crisis before I did. She acted on it when I didn't, and she went into a burning barn at 2 a.m. to save a 16-year-old boy." He looked around the room in the deliberate way of a man who wanted to be sure he was heard in all of it. "I've heard the things being said about her in this town. I want to be direct. Those things are false. I know who's been saying them and I know why. And I'd like the people in this room to consider the source." The silence that followed was the specific silence of a community making up its mind. Hale said something. She didn't catch all of it, something about unsubstantiated claims, but the room had already moved. She could feel it, the subtle collective shift of people who had been uncertain choosing a direction. She sat in the back near the window and felt the heat come into her face in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. She was not a woman who was easily undone by other people's words, good or bad. She'd built herself a considerable resistance to both over the years of needing to. But Nathaniel had said her name in that room in front of those people in that way, and the difference between managing something and being genuinely moved by it was sometimes harder to maintain than she preferred. She managed it, barely. On the ride back to the ranch, the three of them in the wagon under the late July stars, nobody talked for a long while. Reed sat in the wagon bed. Evelyn was on the bench beside Nathaniel. After a while, she said, "You didn't tell me you were going to do that." "I didn't decide until I was standing up," he said. "The part about the barn. It's true. I know it's true." She looked at the road ahead. "I wasn't prepared for it." "I know." A pause. The horse's hooves on the packed road, steady and even. "Does it change anything that I said it?" She thought about the question seriously, which was the only way she knew how to think about things that mattered. "No," she said. "It doesn't change anything." He nodded. "Good," he said, and left it there, which was more than enough. Corbin Staley's response came on a Tuesday morning, forwarded through the Creed Telegraph office. He would take the case. He had contacts in the district commissioner's office. He needed the originals of Reed's copied records and the striker and the witness statements, and he wanted to meet with Nathaniel in Denver within the fortnight. She read the message at the kitchen table and then got up and went out into the yard and stood in the July heat and looked at the black rectangle of earth where the supply barn had been, which was already beginning to acquire the particular pathos of a space that had been something important and was now waiting to find out what it would become. Pete was crossing the yard from the bunkhouse, moving with the slight stiffness he still had from the bruised ribs, and when he saw her, he changed direction and came over. He stood beside her and looked at the barn site. "Doc Fenn says I'll be running by September," he said. "I heard." He was quiet for a moment. He'd been notably quieter since the fire, which she'd noticed and attributed to the particular aftermath of having been very frightened and then very lucky and needing time to reckon with both. "Mrs. Carter," he said. "Pete." "I know I already said it." He was looking at the barn site. "But I wanted to say it again, in case you didn't—" He stopped and started over. "Thank you." She looked at the 16-year-old boy beside her, too young for what he'd been through and already changed by it in ways he probably couldn't name yet. "You're welcome," she said. "Find yourself a proper bunk before winter." He made a sound that was partly a laugh and partly something more complicated and walked on toward the corral. She stayed where she was for a moment longer. The morning was already hot, the July sun with no cloud cover, and the valley still dry and hard-edged. But at the far edge of the mountains to the west, for the first time in weeks, there was a darkness low on the horizon that might, if she was reading it right, be the shape of weather coming. She stood and watched it. It might be nothing. It often was nothing. But the arithmetic of the season, like all arithmetic, had to eventually balance, and the dark line at the edge of the mountains had the particular color of clouds that had water in them. She went back inside to start the morning. The rain came on a Wednesday. Not dramatically. No single crashing storm that announced itself and demanded attention. It arrived the way the drought had arrived, by degrees. A gray morning that stayed gray. A wind shift that brought moisture instead of dust. And then in the early afternoon, a steady, unhurried rain that fell on the cracked earth of the valley and kept falling. By evening, it had soaked in deep enough that the ground smelled like itself again, the particular smell of wet Colorado soil that the hands kept stepping outside to verify with their own senses because they'd stopped trusting that it was real. Evelyn stood at the kitchen window and watched it come down in the last of the afternoon light and thought about the dark line she'd seen on the western mountains 3 weeks ago, and allowed herself a small private satisfaction that turned out to be correct, which was the only kind of satisfaction she trusted. The ranch was still short on feed. The rain didn't change the arithmetic of the next 6 weeks, and she knew it, but it changed something harder to quantify. The feeling that the season itself was an adversary, that each morning was another day of attrition. The rain said the drought was finite. That was worth something even when the numbers hadn't changed. She turned back to the supper. Corbin Staley arrived in Hatchett's Crossing on a Friday morning in early August, having ridden up from Creede where the stage had left him, and Nathaniel brought him to the ranch for the afternoon. He was a small man, compact and precise, with the watchful economy of movement of someone who had learned that other people consistently underestimated him and had decided this was professionally useful rather than personally irritating. He shook Evelyn's hand, looked at the records she and Reed had assembled on the kitchen table, and spent 2 hours going through them without saying much. When he was done, he sat back and said, "The Anderson filing is the strongest. The date discrepancy is documented in 2 independent sources, and Anderson is willing to testify. The Keller boundary issue is strong on the merits, but will take a surveyor's testimony to make land commissioner proof." He tapped the table. "The striker is circumstantial. I wouldn't lean on it. What carries weight is the pattern. Not any single irregularity, but the accumulation of them across multiple transactions." "Can you get the sales unwound?" Nathaniel asked. "The Anderson sale, yes, high confidence. The Keller spread, probably. The others—" Staley tilted his head. "Depends on what the commissioner's office is willing to pursue. The filings they have jurisdiction over are the ones with documented irregularities. I can't promise you what they do with the rest." "What about criminal liability?" Reed said, from the doorway where he'd been leaning. Staley looked at him. "The barn fire is a sheriff's matter, not a land commissioner matter. What I can do is make Hale's conduct so visible to the district authorities that whatever protection he's been operating under in this county gets more expensive to maintain. Men in his position tend to be pragmatic about their exposures." A pause. "My experience is that when their legal position weakens significantly, they often make decisions that look like retreat, but they call business adjustments." He sells what he bought and moves on, Nathaniel said, at distressed prices if the titles are under challenge, which is its own consequence. Staley closed the folder. It's not the same as standing him in front of a judge, I understand that. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. It's enough, Evelyn said. Both men looked at her. It gets the land back to the families who should have it. It exposes what he did to the county record. It makes it too costly for him to continue here. She kept her voice even. Justice on the frontier is usually partial. Partial is better than nothing, and nothing is what we had in July. Staley looked at her with the expression of someone revising an assessment upward. That's a realistic view of the situation. I've had a realistic view of most situations, she said. It saved me considerable disappointment. Nathaniel was watching her with the particular attention he'd been giving her since the town meeting, the attention of a man who'd said something out loud that he hadn't been able to unsay and had found he didn't want to. We proceed, he said to Staley. Whatever you need from us. The next 6 weeks were not easy and were not particularly dramatic. That was the nature of legal processes, which moved in the unglamorous rhythm of documents and correspondence and waiting rather than in the clean arc of confrontation and resolution that made for better stories. Evelyn kept the books, managed the household, supervised the gradual rebuilding of the supply situation as Sam Elliott came through on a second partial order at rates that acknowledged the ongoing relationship. Reed drove cattle to Creed Market in 2 small lots at prices that weren't good, but were enough to cover the most urgent shortfall. The ranch contracted and tightened and continued. She was in the middle of all of it, which was where she'd been since January, and she was also, and this was the thing she'd been slow to acknowledge to herself, beginning to feel something she hadn't felt in 4 years. Not happiness, exactly, which was too simple a word for it. Something more like weight. The weight of a place that had started to feel like it existed in 3 dimensions rather than the 2-dimensional flatness of somewhere you were passing through. She'd been passing through for so long she'd stopped noticing she was doing it. The signs of the change were small. She stopped doing the mental arithmetic of how much she'd saved and how far it would carry her if she needed to leave, which was a calculation she'd been running every month since her husband died, and had become so habitual she barely noticed it. She started thinking in terms of next spring, what the garden could do if it was planned properly, what the household budget would look like after a full year's worth of her accounting adjustments had settled in. She repaired a tear in the curtain of her room, rather than leaving it because she'd been telling herself that fixing things in a temporary space was a waste of time and energy. Small things, the kind that didn't announce themselves until you looked back at them. She was looking back at them on a September evening when the kitchen fire had settled to coals and the house was quiet and she was doing the monthly accounts, and she registered what she'd been doing differently and sat with it for a moment before she went back to the numbers. A knock at the kitchen door frame. Nathaniel. He did that, knocked on open doors, which she'd noticed and cataloged as part of his particular way of moving through a space he owned without treating everything in it as automatically available to him. Late for accounts, he said. I was thinking. She looked up. Come in. He came in and made the coffee he often made at this hour and sat down across the table the way he'd been sitting across this table since February, with the ease of something that had long since stopped being unusual. Staley sent a telegraph today, he said. She hadn't heard. And? The district commissioner's office has opened a formal review of the Anderson and Keller filings. They've notified Hale. He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. Staley says Hale's lawyer in Denver made contact with his office this afternoon, unofficially. She understood what that meant. He wants to settle. Staley's word was discuss options, which means the same thing at this stage. Nathaniel looked at his coffee. He's going to offer to unwind the Anderson and Keller sales and pay something toward the other families in exchange for the review not going further. Will that be enough for the commissioner's office? Staley thinks so. The office wants the irregularities corrected, not a long public proceeding. A pause. It won't be everything. No, it won't. She thought about Martin Anderson in the boarding house on Mill Street, who'd sold because he thought he had no choice. About the Keller family's 60 acres that had ended up on Hale's side of a boundary that was drawn wrong. About the other families who'd taken Hale's money under the pressure of a drought he'd used like a weapon, and who would likely see nothing returned. But it gets the land back where it belongs, and Hale leaves. Staley's condition on the settlement is relocation of his holdings. He won't be permitted to maintain operations in this county. Something in Nathaniel's voice, very quiet, had the sound of a door closing. He'll sell what's left at whatever he can get and go somewhere else. And start again somewhere else, she said. Probably. He looked at her directly. That bothers you? Yes. She didn't soften it. Men like that don't stop. They find different ground and do the same things. The families here get their land back, and someone in the next valley gets Victor Hale. She turned her pen over in her fingers. It bothers me. It doesn't change what's the right decision for this situation. He nodded slowly. You know what I keep thinking about? He said. She waited. March, when you showed me those projections and I said no. He looked at the table. If I'd said yes, we'd have had enough feed to get through even after the fire. We wouldn't have spent the summer in the situation we were in. You made the right call with what you knew in March, she said. The risk calculus was genuinely different then. I know. I've thought about it carefully enough to know that. He looked up. I've also thought about the fact that you did what I should have done, with your own money, when I wasn't willing to move, and that you did it without telling me, which I was angry about, and which I've come around to understanding was the only way it would have gotten done. Nathaniel, I'm not relitigating it, he said. I'm saying I understand it now in a way I didn't in April. A pause. You made a judgment about what was necessary, and you did it. That's what this ranch needed, and I couldn't see it. He held her gaze. I don't want that to happen again, the not seeing it part. She looked at him carefully. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that you've been managing this household for 8 months, and what you've actually been doing is running a significant part of this operation, the accounting, the supply chain, the forward planning, the crisis management. He said it in the even tone of someone who'd thought it through to the bottom. I'd like to formalize that. A partnership arrangement in the business operation of the ranch, not just the household, the full accounts, the supply contracts, the planning decisions. He paused. With the authority to act when acting is what the situation requires. The kitchen was very still. She'd had moments in her life that she recognized as pivots, the moments when the world offered a different version of forward than the one she'd been walking toward. She'd learned to recognize them, and she'd learned to be careful with them, because the thing about pivots was that they required you to trust the direction before you could see the destination. That's a significant offer, she said. I know what it is. You'd be giving me authority over decisions that could affect everything you've built. You've already been making those decisions, he said. The difference is whether you're doing it with my knowledge and support or without it because I'm not paying attention. He let that land. I'd rather know. She looked at him across the kitchen table. This man she'd spent 8 months learning in the particular way you learned someone you worked beside closely, which was different from most other kinds of knowing. She knew how he thought, the shape of his deliberateness, and the specific places where his blind spots were. She knew what he'd built and what it had cost him, and what he was willing to risk and what he wasn't. She knew he was not a man who said things he didn't mean, and she knew that this offer had been building in him for longer than tonight. I want it in writing, she said, something at the corner of his mouth. I expected you would. A proper agreement. Staley can draft it when he's in the area. Agreed. And I want the rebuild of the supply barn to include proper fire separation from the main structure. The proximity was a problem. He blinked. Then he laughed, a short, genuine sound that she'd heard rarely enough that each time had the quality of something valuable. All right, he said, and I want a proper desk in the office. The table in there is too small for the full set of ledger books. You can have the whole office, he said. I don't need the whole office, just a proper desk. Evelyn. She stopped. He was looking at her the way he'd been looking at her since July, with the full weight of a man who had made his peace with what he felt and was no longer managing it carefully. Is that all? He said. She held his gaze and understood the question underneath the question, which was not about desks or fire separation or written agreements. She'd known it was coming. She'd been honest with herself about it for weeks, which meant she'd been honest about what her answer was, which meant she'd been carrying the answer around while the timing sorted itself out. No, she said. That's not all. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. the right hand, the one that had been burned, the one that still had a faint pink scar at the palm that the doctor said would fade by winter. He held it carefully, with the deliberateness of someone who understood what they were holding. She turned her hand over and held his back. Martin Anderson got his land back in October. The settlement was completed with the district commissioner's office in the second week of the month, and Staley telegraphed the details. Anderson and Keller reinstated to their original claims, a financial settlement to 3 other families that wouldn't make them whole but would help. And Victor Hale's remaining Valley holdings listed for sale under conditions that made clear his future in the county was finished. Anderson came to the ranch the day after he got word. He didn't have an appointment. He drove up in his old wagon and knocked on the front door, and when Evelyn answered, he stood on the porch with his hat in his hands and said, "I heard it was your doing, the record search." "It was Reed's work primarily," she said. "He went to Creed and found what was there." "I heard differently." He looked at her steadily. He was a compact man in his 50s, weathered in the way of outdoor men, with the particular dignity of someone who'd been humiliated by circumstances and had come out the other side of it without becoming bitter, which was harder than it looked. "I wanted to say thank you, in person." "You're welcome," she said, "in person." He put his hat back on. He started to leave, then stopped. "That boy Denny, Hale's man. The sheriff in Creed has questions for him about the night of the fire. I heard that too. I heard the same. Don't know if anything will come of it." "No," she said. "Neither do I." He nodded. He looked at the rebuilt supply barn. The frame was up, the walls half-sided, a proper distance from the main structure this time at her insistence, and something in his expression settled. "Good-looking barn," he said. "It'll be finished by November," she said. He drove back down the road and she stood on the porch watching him go and thought about partial justice and what it was worth, and concluded, not for the first time, that it was worth more than it sounded like. Anderson was going back to his land. The Kellers were going back to their corrected boundary. Hale was leaving. The mechanism of accountability was imperfect and slow and worked better for some people than others, which was a true thing about the world that she'd known since before she left Ohio and had not stopped knowing since. But it had worked. Slowly, imperfectly, incompletely. It had worked. She went back inside. The new desk arrived from Creed in the 3rd week of October, delivered on a supply wagon and carried into the office by Billy and Cesar, while Evelyn supervised the placement, which required 2 repositionings before it was right relative to the window light. Reed observed this process from the doorway with the expression of a man pretending not to be entertained. "If you move it one more time," he said, "we're going to need a new floor." "It needs the natural light from the left," she said. "Otherwise I'm working against my eyes." "God forbid." "Reed." Right. He pushed off the door frame. "I've got the November supply estimates on the old table when you're ready. Give me 10 minutes. He went back to the kitchen. She looked at the desk in its final position, solid oak, larger than the old table, with 3 drawers on the right side that locked, and ran her hand along the surface. It was a practical object. She was a practical person. She did not feel sentimental about furniture. She felt something anyway. She put it away and went to get Reed's supply estimates. The first snow came in November, light and early, a few inches that settled on the rebuilt barn roof and the fence lines and the garden she'd put in behind the house in late September, which was too late for most things, but had managed to produce a row of root vegetables that were now in the cellar and would last well into winter. She'd planted it without entirely meaning to, had started clearing the space one afternoon in a practical frame of mind about soil condition, and had kept going until she had a proper kitchen garden laid out, and then felt slightly embarrassed about having gotten that committed to a thing without consciously deciding to. Nathaniel had seen her doing it and said nothing, which she understood as its own form of comment. They'd settled into something that didn't have a clean name. It wasn't the professional arrangement it had been in the winter, wasn't only that, but it wasn't something she had adequate domestic vocabulary for either, 2 people who'd arrived at closeness through work and crisis and the accumulated weight of months spent solving the same problems, who now moved through the same house with the ease of long habit and the awareness of something more that neither of them was in a particular rush to categorize. She'd had a marriage before. She knew what marriage was and what it cost and what it gave back. She wasn't afraid of it. She also wasn't in a hurry. There was, for the first time in years, a future that didn't feel like a threat. She could afford to move through it at a reasonable pace. On a November evening, with the first snow on the ground, and the kitchen warm, and Reed's supply estimates checked and approved and filed, she sat at the new desk and looked at the ledger books arranged on the shelf, and thought about the woman who'd pushed open a saloon door 11 months ago, ice in her hair, $300 in savings, and nothing else, and had asked not for help but for work. She thought about what she'd known then, which was considerable, and what she hadn't known, which was everything that mattered. Here was what she'd learned. Not any single lesson, but an accumulation, the kind of understanding that built up the way silt built up, slowly and without announcement, until one day you noticed the riverbed had changed shape. The things people thought were your weaknesses were sometimes just the parts of you they hadn't figured out how to use yet. She'd walked into Whitaker Ranch as the wrong kind of person, in the wrong kind of role, and had spent months being evaluated against expectations she'd never agreed to, and the expectations had turned out to be the problem rather than her. You didn't fix that by becoming what people expected. You fixed it by being so specifically and undeniably useful that expectations had to rearrange themselves around you. And yet, she'd also learned the limits of that. There were things she'd been too proud to ask for that she should have asked for. There were moments when the competence she'd built into a kind of armor had kept people at exactly the distance she'd intended, and also exactly the distance she hadn't. She'd arrived with the walls up high because high walls had kept her moving through 4 years of hard country, and she'd had to learn, slowly, incompletely, still learning, that a place you intended to stay required different architecture than a place you were passing through. You couldn't make a home inside a fortress. She heard Nathaniel's footsteps in the hall. She knew his walk as well as she knew the sound of the kitchen stove. And then he knocked on the open office door. "You're still up," he said, finishing the November projections. He came in and looked at the desk in the lamplight. "It fits the room." "I told you it would." He sat down in the chair across from the desk, which nobody had sat in before because the desk had only been there 3 weeks, and stretched his legs out in the way of a man tired from a long day outdoors. He looked at the ledger books on the shelf, the correspondence filed in order, the November projections in her handwriting spread on the desk between them. "Reed tells me the barn will be closed in by end of month," he said. "He told me the same. Timber's already on site. Warmer winter than last year, if the signs are right. Billy says so. I don't know how he reads it, but he's been right before. Billy's better at weather than most things." A pause. "He asked me this week if he could stay on permanently. Stop treating it as seasonal work." "What did you tell him?" "I told him to ask you," Nathaniel said. She looked at him. "He works in the household more than the ranch," Nathaniel said, steadily and without any edge she could detect. "Seems like your call." "He's a good worker," she said, "when he stops talking. High bar. He'll meet it eventually." She looked down at the projections. "Tell him yes." "I'll tell him you said yes." She looked up again. He was watching her with the ease and attention that she'd grown so accustomed to that its absence, she knew now, would be a specific loss rather than a general one, the way the absence of a sound you'd stopped noticing would be a silence with a shape. "Nathaniel," she said. "Evelyn." She had not planned to say what she said next. She'd been sitting on it for weeks without intending to surface it tonight, and yet here it was, arriving on its own schedule the way the important things sometimes did. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. He was still. "I know the arrangement is formal on paper, and I know we haven't said much more than that." She kept her voice even. "But I want you to know that I'm not building an exit. I haven't been building an exit for a while now. I thought you should know that." He was quiet for a moment. The snow was light on the roof, and the fire in the office hearth had settled to the long, steady burn of a fire with good wood in it. "I know," he said. "I've known for a while." "How long?" He thought about it. "When you planted the garden," he said. "In September. Too late for most things, too early for winter. You planted it anyway. He held her gaze. That's not something you do in a place you're leaving. She looked at him across the desk, across the ledger books and the November projections and the practical landscape of a shared enterprise, and thought that there were many ways to tell someone the truth, and most of them did not require the elaborate architecture of declaration. Sometimes the truth was in a kitchen garden planted too late in the season. Sometimes it was in a hand turned palm up on a table. Sometimes it was just two people sitting in the same room at the end of a hard year, tired and clear-eyed and without pretense, knowing exactly where they were. "Good night, Nathaniel," she said. "Good night, Evelyn." He went out. She finished the projections and filed them and closed the ledger books and put out the lamp. Outside, the snow was still falling, quiet and even, covering the ranch in the patient way of winters that intended to stay. The rebuilt barn, half-sided, caught the moonlight on its new timber. The fence lines ran straight to the edge of what she could see. The mountains beyond were dark shapes against a sky that had cleared at the edges, stars appearing where the clouds had thinned. This was the thing she had not been able to see from inside the 4 years of moving, that what she'd been looking for wasn't a place safe enough to stop. She'd been safe enough in plenty of places, and had kept moving anyway, because safety was not the same as belonging, and she'd been chasing the wrong thing. Belonging wasn't something you found. It was something you built, the same way you built anything worth having. Badly at first, then better, with setbacks and arguments and mistakes, and the long, slow accumulation of days in which you chose to stay. You couldn't arrive at it. You could only work your way into it. She'd been working her way into this place since the night she'd pushed open a saloon door and refused to ask for anything except what she'd earned. She went down the hall to her room and closed the door and lay in the dark listening to the snow and the quiet of the house and the particular quality of stillness that a place had when all the people in it were where they were supposed to be. And she let herself, for the first time in a long time, stop planning the next move. There wasn't one. She was already where she was going.